They were the most powerful men in American history. They commanded armies, shaped nations, and carried secrets that entire governments worked to protect. And then they died. Some went quietly, some went violently. Some went under circumstances so strange, so suspicious, so buried under official explanations that historians are still arguing about them today. What if I told you that one president's doctors almost certainly killed him faster than his assassin did? That two presidents died on the exact same date, the 4th of July, and a third died just 5 years later on that same day? That a sitting president's embalmer was likely drunk? That one commander-in-chief's last words have been deliberately scrubbed from the official record? That a president's body was exhumed decades after burial because people genuinely could not agree on what killed him? You might think some of this sounds like conspiracy territory. And honestly, some of it is contested. We'll tell you when that's the case. But a lot of what you're about to hear is documented, sourced, and sitting in medical records, autopsy reports, and congressional archives that most people never think to read. We've done that reading for you. This is 100 secrets about the deaths of the United States presidents. The things left out of textbooks, the details that got buried alongside the men themselves. The medical mysteries, the funeral oddities, the deathbed confessions, and the quiet coincidences that have haunted American history for over 2 centuries. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a like on this video. This kind of deep history doesn't always get surfaced by the algorithm, and your support genuinely helps. Now settle in, keep the lights low, and let's begin. 1. George Washington's final bloodletting on the morning of December 14th, 1799. George Washington woke up struggling to breathe. His doctors were called. They did what doctors did in 1799. They bled him multiple times. Washington's physicians removed somewhere between 5 and 9 pints of blood over the course of that single day. To put that in perspective, the human body holds roughly 10 to 12 pints total. They took out nearly half of what he had, possibly more. The medical logic at the time was that removing blood would reduce inflammation and restore balance to the body's humors. The actual effect, by modern understanding, was to send Washington into hypovolemic shock, dropping his blood pressure and accelerating organ failure. His doctors weren't trying to kill him. They genuinely believed they were helping. But the treatment that was supposed to save the first president almost certainly helped end him. Some historians argue the bloodletting was the decisive factor. Others say he was already too far gone. Either way, the man who survived Valley Forge crossed the Delaware in a snowstorm and outlasted a war against the most powerful military on earth, was felled in part by his own physicians. 2. Washington's throat infection. Before the bleeding even began, Washington was already in serious trouble. The illness that started his final decline was almost certainly a severe bacterial infection of the throat and upper airway. Modern physicians examining the historical accounts have suggested the most likely culprit was acute epiglottitis, a condition where the tissue at the base of the tongue swells so rapidly and severely that it begins to close off the airway entirely. Washington reportedly woke in the early hours with difficulty swallowing, a hoarse voice, and labored breathing. By morning, those symptoms had worsened dramatically. The infection moved fast. In an era before antibiotics, before sterile instruments, before even a basic understanding of bacterial illness, there was essentially nothing medicine could reliably do. A modern emergency room might have intubated him, administered antibiotics, brought the swelling down within hours. In 1799, his doctors applied poultices, administered purgatives, and bled him repeatedly. Washington reportedly told his physicians at one point to let him go without an uneasy or painful struggle. He seemed to understand, even if they didn't, that the fight was already lost. 3. John Adams and July 4, 1826. Here's a coincidence so precise it sounds invented. On July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the second president of the United States, John Adams, died. Not approximately 50 years, not close to the date. The exact anniversary. Adams was 90 years old, the longest-lived president at the time, and he had held on through his final illness with what people close to him described as a quiet determination to reach the milestone. Whether that determination was conscious or purely biological, no one can say. But he made it. He died in his home in Quincy, Massachusetts, in the afternoon hours of that 4th of July, as celebrations rang out across the young country he had helped create. The date alone would be enough to cement the moment in history. But the day held one more extraordinary detail, one that Adams himself did not know as he drew his final breaths. 4. Adams's last words about Jefferson, John Adams's reported last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He said it believing his old friend, his rival, his fellow founder, was still alive. The two men had a complicated history. They had been allies in revolution, bitter opponents during the presidency years, and then late-in-life correspondents who exchanged warm and philosophically rich letters well into old age. Adams died not knowing that Jefferson had already preceded him. Jefferson had died earlier that same July 4th, hours before Adams spoke those final words. Whether Adams sensed something, or whether the words were simply the thoughts of a fading mind drifting toward the friend he had been writing to for years, no one recorded. What is documented is that his last coherent utterance was wrong in its fact and haunting in its poetry. It stands as one of the most quietly devastating final statements in American presidential history. 5. Thomas Jefferson's same-day death. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, just hours before John Adams spoke his name for the last time. Jefferson was 83 years old and had been declining for weeks at his home, Monticello in Virginia. He had reportedly held on through his final days with visible effort, asking his attending physician repeatedly whether it was yet the 4th. When the date finally arrived in the early morning hours, Jefferson slipped into unconsciousness. He died around noon. The fact that two of the three primary authors of the Declaration of Independence died on the same day, the 50th anniversary of that document's adoption, was treated immediately and widely as something beyond ordinary coincidence. Ministers preached about it, newspapers called it providential. Americans across the country interpreted it as a sign, though a sign of what exactly depended entirely on who was doing the interpreting. Even today, the statistical odds of that overlap draw genuine reflection from historians who study the period. 6. Jefferson's debt at death. Thomas Jefferson died broke. Not struggling financially, not stretched thin, but genuinely and catastrophically in debt. Estimates place the amount he owed at somewhere around $100,000 at the time of his death, a sum that would translate to millions in today's terms. Jefferson had lived expensively for decades. Monticello itself was an ongoing financial drain. He had borrowed heavily, often to cover previous debts, and the cycle never reversed. His family was left in a brutal position. Most of his enslaved workers were sold to settle the estate's obligations. Monticello itself was eventually sold. His daughter Martha spent much of her remaining life in financial difficulty. The man who wrote that all men are endowed with certain unalienable rights, including the pursuit of happiness, died having spent his own in a manner that left the people closest to him and the people he enslaved and then bequeathed as property without stability or security. The debt was not a secret during his lifetime, but the full weight of it landed hardest after he was gone. 7. James Monroe's 3rd July 4, 5 years after Adams and Jefferson, Independence Day claimed another president. James Monroe died on July 4, 1831 in New York City at the age of 73. By then, the coincidence was no longer just a curiosity, it was a pattern. 3 of the first 5 presidents, all founding-era figures, dying on the nation's birthday. Ministers and newspaper editors leaned into the symbolism hard. Monroe was not a declaration signer, but he was a Revolutionary War veteran, a 2-term president, and the man whose name was on the doctrine that defined an entire hemisphere of American ambition. His decline had been slow, marked by chronic illness and complications from what was likely tuberculosis and heart disease. When he finally died, the date wrapped his passing in instant mythology. Ordinary Americans read about it in the papers and saw a kind of script in history, as if the generation that made the country had chosen their exit dates to send a message. The reality was far more mundane: aging bodies, limited medicine, and coincidence dressed up as destiny. But the story stuck. Monroe became the quiet third point on a strange presidential triangle of July 4th deaths. 8. Monroe's initial New York burial for a Virginian president so closely linked to the South. Monroe's first burial was not in Virginia at all. It was in Manhattan. After his death in 1831, Monroe's body was interred in the New York City Marble Cemetery, a private walled graveyard tucked into what is now the East Village. He had been living in New York with his daughter and son-in-law, dependent on their hospitality and far from the plantation world where he'd built his career. Like Jefferson, Monroe died with serious financial problems. His estate was tangled in debts, and there was no immediate elaborate plan for a grand state funeral or a triumphant return home. He was buried modestly, above ground in a family vault, in a city that was not his own. For 27 years, that's where he stayed. Visitors could, in theory, pay respects to a former president in a small urban cemetery, surrounded by brick walls and tenements. Then, in 1858, Virginia decided that one of its native sons should not rest permanently in a New York vault. The state arranged for his remains to be exhumed and transported south by steamboat. They gave him a new grave in Richmond's Hollywood Cemetery, under an ornate Gothic-style cast-iron canopy nicknamed the Birdcage. The reburial turned Monroe's resting place into a site of regional pride, but it also erased the quieter fact that, for nearly 3 decades, a founding-era president lay largely unnoticed in a crowded northern city. 9. James Madison's quiet decline. James Madison did not get a symbolic exit date or a dramatic final scene. He faded out slowly. By the early 1830s, the 4th president was an old man at Montpelier, his Virginia plantation, dealing with chronic rheumatism, frailty, and what contemporary accounts described as general debility. He had outlived his presidency by nearly 2 decades. Visitors still came to see him, to ask about the Constitution, to hear stories of the founding, but the man who had once been at the center of every major political argument in the young republic now rarely left his chair. In June of 1836, his health declined further. Friends and family suggested he take stimulants to try to prolong his life just a few more days so he might die on July 4th like his peers. Madison refused. According to a later account from a relative, he chose to let his body set its own schedule. On the morning of June 28, 1836, he tried to speak at breakfast, his voice failed, and he died quietly in his bedroom shortly afterward, at age 85. No crowds gathered outside the house. There was no national telegraph network to flash the news. Word of his passing moved slowly, like everything else in his final years. The father of the Constitution slipped away in relative privacy, leaving behind a country that had already begun to move past the generation that made it. 10. Madison's simple burial. Madison's funeral and burial matched the tone of his last years, restrained, local, almost understated. He was laid to rest at Montpelier, in the family cemetery on the property, not in a grand national mausoleum or a capital city tomb. A small group of neighbors, friends, and enslaved people from the plantation attended. There was no massive procession, no long line of dignitaries, no thousands of mourners lining city streets as would happen for later presidents like Lincoln or McKinley. A brief service was held. A simple coffin was lowered into the ground. A modest obelisk would later mark the spot, but for some time even that marker was weathered and in need of repair. The federal government did not immediately rush to enshrine Madison as a public monument. He was, at his death, respected, but not yet the almost sacred constitutional figure he would later become in textbooks. His burial reflected that in-between status, just another Virginia planter being laid in the family plot, even if this particular planter had helped design the framework of American government. The simplicity stands in quiet contrast to the elaborate, televised state funerals that would define presidential deaths in the modern era. 11. John Quincy Adams in the House chamber. John Quincy Adams is one of the few presidents who died literally in the halls of power. Long after leaving the White House, he returned to Washington as a member of the House of Representatives and served there for nearly 17 years. He was in his 70s, stubborn, sharp-tongued, and absolutely unwilling to retire. On February 21, 1848, he was seated at his desk in the House chamber when he suddenly slumped over, unable to stand. He had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, what we would now call a massive stroke, right there on the floor of the House while debate was underway. Colleagues rushed to his aid. The atmosphere was shocked but hushed. This was not the assassinations and public chaos of later eras, but a sudden medical collapse of an old man who had pushed his body and mind hard for decades. They carried him from the chamber to a nearby room off the House floor, what was then known as the Speaker's Room. For a man who had been a diplomat, a senator, a president, and then an outspoken, often lonely voice against slavery and for civil liberties, it was fitting in an almost theatrical way that his final collapse came in the very building where he had spent so many years arguing with his country. 12. Adams's final stroke. Adams did not die immediately. He lay on a couch in the Speaker's Room, partially conscious, partially paralyzed, attended by physicians and family members. For 2 days he drifted in and out. Witnesses reported that he managed a few brief words, including a final sentiment often quoted as, "This is the last of earth. I am content though, like many last words, the exact phrasing depends on who was remembering." The medical reality was grim and straightforward. A major blood vessel in his brain had ruptured. In the mid-19th century, there was nothing doctors could do to reverse the damage or reduce the pressure. No surgery, no clot-busting drugs, no intensive care units. On February 23, 1848, John Quincy Adams died in that small room inside the Capitol. His body was later moved and given the honors appropriate to a former president, but the place of his death remained unusual. Not at home, not on a battlefield, not in a hospital, but inside the legislative heart of the government he had spent his lifetime serving and criticizing in almost equal measure. 13. Andrew Jackson's chronic decline. Andrew Jackson liked to project the image of a man too tough to die, but his final years told a different story. By the 1840s, the hero of New Orleans was essentially an invalid at the Hermitage, his Tennessee plantation, living with near constant pain. Contemporary accounts describe chronic diarrhea, severe coughing fits, labored breathing, swelling in his legs and abdomen, and episodes of chest pain that sound very much like congestive heart failure. His body was breaking down from decades of injuries, infections, and primitive medical treatments. Jackson himself blamed some of his suffering on old war wounds and what he called dropsy, an old term for edema, the fluid buildup that made his limbs and face puff and his movements slow. Visitors who had known the fierce general were startled by how frail he looked near the end, propped up in bed or in a chair, struggling for breath but still forcing himself into conversations about politics and faith. When he died on June 8, 1845, at 78, his doctors recorded heart troubles, lung issues, and generalized debility rather than a single clean cause. It was less a dramatic final battle and more a long surrender of an overused body that had been pushed far past its medical limits for decades. 14. Bullets. Still inside Jackson, Jackson's medical chart was not just disease, it was metal. His body literally carried pieces of past violence to his grave. In 1806, he fought a duel with Charles Dickinson, a skilled marksman who shot Jackson in the chest. The bullet shattered ribs and lodged near his heart. Operating at that depth with early 19th century tools was almost a death sentence, so surgeons left it in place. Jackson lived the rest of his life with that bullet inside him, sometimes causing pain, sometimes oozing, always a reminder. Then in 1813, he took 2 more bullets in a frontier street fight in Nashville, one in the shoulder, one in the arm. One of those pieces of lead was eventually removed, but the other remained. Decades later, doctors noted that fragments still sat under his skin, encased in scar tissue. Some accounts from those who saw his body after death mention visible scars and discolored areas where the bullets had traveled. Modern historians and physicians looking back have speculated that the chronic infections, abscesses, and inflammation around those old wounds may have contributed to his long-term health decline. Jackson joked in life that he was made of hickory, but the truth was stranger. A former president walked around for years as a kind of living archive of early American violence, with foreign objects lodged deep inside him that even the best doctors of his era dared not fully remove. 15. Martin Van Buren's long breathing troubles. If Jackson's decline was loud and bloody, Martin Van Buren's was quieter but no less miserable. By the early 1860s, the 8th president was an elderly man in upstate New York, living at his Kinderhook estate, Lindenwold, increasingly defined by his inability to breathe comfortably. Physicians at the time described chronic asthma, a catch-all term they used for recurring shortness of breath, wheezing, and chest tightness. Van Buren also showed signs of heart disease, with swelling, fatigue, and episodes where he felt faint or weak. In an era before inhalers, oxygen therapy, or diuretics, there was very little doctors could do beyond tonics, bloodletting, and rest. The man who had once been a nimble political operator, gliding through Washington's salons and Senate chambers, now spent much of his time seated or in bed, sleeping propped up to ease his lungs. He outlived many of his contemporaries, reaching 79, but the last stretch was marked by repeated bouts of respiratory distress. On July 24, 1862, amid the Civil War he had tried and failed to prevent 2 decades earlier, Van Buren died at home. His doctors listed asthma and heart disease as contributing causes, a combination that modern medicine would likely label chronic heart failure with secondary lung complications. There was no dramatic final scene, no great last words recorded, just an aging statesman slowly suffocating in a house far from the new front lines ripping his country apart. 16. Van Buren's modest farewell, Van Buren's funeral, looked nothing like the grand, choreographed state ceremonies that later presidents would receive. He died in a small community, and his burial reflected that scale. The service took place in Kinderhook, the village where he had been born and which he had never really left in his mind, no matter how far national politics carried him. Local reports describe a respectful turnout, with neighbors, townspeople, a few political figures, and family members forming the core of the mourners. There were tributes in newspapers, of course, and flags lowered in Washington, but there were no endless lines of public viewing stretching through the Capitol, no train draped in black, carrying his coffin across multiple states the way it would for Lincoln just 3 years later. His body was laid to rest in the Kinderhook Reformed Church Cemetery, in a family plot marked by a substantial but not overwhelming monument. Today you can walk up to it without passing through a massive security cordon or a national shrine infrastructure. The simplicity of his funeral and grave undercuts the later textbook image of every president receiving a kind of automatic, national-level canonization at death. In the mid-19th century, former presidents could slip back into local life and local death without the country fully stopping to watch. 17. William Henry Harrison's 31 Days. William Henry Harrison's presidency is remembered less for what he did in office and more for how quickly he left it. He was inaugurated on March 4, 1841, an aging military hero presented to the public as the rugged log cabin and hard cider candidate. The famous story says he refused to wear a coat during a long, cold inaugural address and caught the illness that killed him that day. Historians now point out that his symptoms didn't appear until 3 weeks later, making that neat cause and effect unlikely. What we do know is that by late March, Harrison developed fatigue, chills, and what his doctors described as a catarrhal illness, congestion, coughing, and respiratory discomfort, that soon progressed to severe weakness, abdominal pain, and difficulty breathing. His personal physicians tried every tool available to them: bloodletting, opium, brandy, enemas, blistering agents on the skin. None of it worked. He grew delirious, reportedly muttering about the presidency and his duty, then slipping in and out of consciousness. On April 4, 1841, just 31 days after taking office, Harrison died in the White House. The country had never seen a president die so soon after inauguration. The Constitution's vague language about succession suddenly became very real, and the vice president, John Tyler, asserted that he was now fully president, not just acting in the role. Harrison's medical decline was a personal tragedy, but it also forced the young system of American government to confront, for the first time, what happens when a president simply doesn't live long enough to govern. 18. Harrison's mysterious final illness for generations. Schoolbooks said Harrison died of pneumonia, a straightforward narrative that matched the image of an old general standing coatless in the March chill. His attending doctors did diagnose pneumonia based on his fever, cough, and chest pain. The official terms used at the time were pneumonia and pleurisy, inflammation of the lungs and the lining around them. But modern historians and medical researchers have gone back and re-examined the records, his symptoms, and even the state of Washington's water supply in 1841, and some now question that tidy diagnosis. Their theory is that Harrison may have died from something like typhoid fever or a severe gastrointestinal infection, possibly caused by contaminated drinking water in the White House. They point to severe stomach pain, diarrhea, and a pattern of worsening over days that doesn't neatly match classic pneumonia alone. The sewers of early 19th century Washington were notoriously close to the city's water sources. Presidents, like everyone else, drank from systems we would consider unsafe today. To be clear, this newer theory is not universally accepted. There was no autopsy, and the language of 19th century medical notes doesn't map perfectly onto modern categories. So Harrison's exact cause of death sits in a gray zone. Officially, he remains the president who died of pneumonia after the shortest term in history. Unofficially, his death has become a small medical mystery, a reminder that even at the highest levels of power, people in that era lived and died in a world of limited diagnostics and contaminated infrastructure. 19. The inauguration coat myth. The story you probably heard is simple. William Henry Harrison gave a 2-hour inaugural speech in cold, wet March weather, refused to wear a coat or hat, and promptly died of pneumonia as a kind of moral lesson about vanity. It's tidy, memorable, and almost certainly wrong. The timeline alone undermines it. Harrison didn't start showing serious symptoms until about 3 weeks after the inauguration, far beyond the usual incubation period for a respiratory infection triggered by a single exposure to cold. His doctors described a gradual onset of fatigue, congestion, and abdominal distress, not a sudden crash right after the big day. Modern medical historians who've gone back through the case notes and contemporary accounts point out that 19th century Washington had a filthy water system, open sewers, and overcrowded boarding houses, creating perfect conditions for diseases like typhoid and other gastrointestinal infections. From that angle, the no-coat anecdote begins to look less like science and more like a moral fable Victorians told each other about the dangers of pride and long speeches. The coat story survived because it was easy to teach to school children. The reality, a mix of bad infrastructure and limited medicine, is less theatrical but far more revealing about how even a president was vulnerable to the everyday hazards of his era. 20. John Tyler's Confederate funeral. When John Tyler died in January 1862, he was a former president of the United States, but the United States did not claim him. Instead, the government that honored him was the Confederacy, the breakaway slaveholding states he had thrown his political weight behind after leaving office. By the time of his death, Tyler was serving in the Provisional Confederate Congress in Richmond, actively helping to shape the rebellion's government and arguing for secession as a constitutional right. When he collapsed, likely from a stroke or heart issue, Confederate leaders treated him as one of their own. His coffin was draped with the Confederate flag, not the stars and stripes. Cannons fired in salute from Confederate positions. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, praised him in official messages. In Richmond streets, he was mourned as the first prominent national figure to die in the cause of the Confederacy. No similar gestures came from Washington. There was no joint ceremony, no attempt at a shared moment of mourning across enemy lines. Tyler's funeral arrangements quietly established a strange historical category, a former president of the United States who, in death, was symbolically claimed by a government at war with the country he once led. 21. Tyler's unusual official silence. The lack of union recognition for John Tyler's death wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate silence. Traditionally, when a former president died, Congress passed resolutions of respect, flags were lowered, and official mourning rituals signaled that, whatever partisan fights had happened in life, the office itself was being honored in death. That pattern broke with Tyler because he had openly supported secession and accepted a position in the Confederate government. Many in Washington saw him not just as a political opponent, but as a traitor. When news of his death reached the Capitol, there was no congressional resolution, no national day of mourning, no official funeral observances. Records from the time show only minimal acknowledgement in federal proceedings, and even that was restrained. In effect, the government treated him as someone who had stepped outside the circle of former presidents, entitled to automatic ritual respect. Textbooks sometimes glide past this, listing his dates of birth and death without mentioning that the United States he once led chose not to memorialize him formally. Tyler's end illustrates an uncomfortable truth. The presidential fraternity has never been entirely unconditional. crossed certain lines, especially during Civil War, and even the symbolic protections of the office can be quietly withdrawn. 22. James K. Polk's sudden cholera death. James K. Polk left the presidency in March 1849 at just 53, looking older than many of the men who would eventually outlive him by decades. His single term had been intense, overseeing the Mexican-American War, managing rapid territorial expansion, and driving himself with such relentless focus that contemporaries commented on his exhaustion. Within months of returning to Tennessee, he was dead. The most widely accepted cause is cholera, a violent intestinal infection that swept through parts of the United States in recurring epidemics during the 19th century. Polk likely encountered the disease while traveling, or soon after settling into his Nashville home. Contemporary reports describe classic symptoms: severe diarrhea, vomiting, rapid dehydration, and sudden collapse. Medical treatment at the time: opium, purgatives, bleeding, restorative drinks, often made things worse. There was no real understanding of the cholera bacterium or how contaminated water spread it. Polk's body, already worn down from years of sleeplessness and chronic ailments, had little reserve to fight such an aggressive infection. He died on June 15, 1849, roughly 3 months after leaving office, becoming one of the clearest reminders that 19th century presidents lived in the same epidemiological world as everyone else, where a glass of bad water could erase a national figure almost overnight. 23. Polk's brief retirement. For all the power he wielded. James K. Polk experienced almost none of what we think of as a presidential retirement. After leaving Washington in March 1849, he embarked on a slow journey back to the South, stopping in cities along the way, greeted by crowds, dinners, and public ceremonies that must have been exhausting for a man already visibly drained. He had grand plans for the next phase of life, reorganizing his finances, managing his plantations, writing his reflections, and finally enjoying private time with his wife Sarah. Instead, his post-presidency compressed into a few crowded weeks. He arrived at his new home, Polk Place in Nashville, in April. By late May or early June, he was already sick. Cholera moved fast. Within days he was bedridden, and within weeks he was gone. Historians who track how long presidents live after leaving office note that Polk's retirement of about 3 months remains the shortest of any. Others, like John Quincy Adams and Herbert Hoover, went on to decades of public service after the White House. Polk never really had that chance. His story undercuts the modern image of ex-presidents building libraries, touring the world, or reinventing themselves. In his case, the line between holding office and the grave was almost frighteningly thin. 24. Zachary Taylor's 5-day illness. Zachary Taylor's death in 1850 unfolded with disturbing speed, beginning on what should have been a patriotic afternoon. On July 4th, he attended festivities in Washington, listened to speeches, and, according to multiple accounts, consumed generous amounts of raw fruit, often described as cherries, and iced milk or water in the summer heat. Within hours, he felt unwell. Over the next day or two, he developed cramps, severe diarrhea, vomiting, and intense abdominal pain. His doctors diagnosed cholera morbus, a broad term they used for acute gastrointestinal illness, and treated him with the standard toolkit of the era: opium, calomel, a mercury compound, bleeding, and various tonics. None of it helped. His condition worsened steadily. Witnesses described him as restless, feverish, and increasingly weak, sometimes rallying for a few hours before slipping back. On July 9th, just 5 days after the first symptoms, Taylor died in the White House at 65. Because his decline was so rapid, and the origin seemed tied to something he had eaten or drunk, later generations floated theories of deliberate poisoning. But tissue tests done in the 1990s on exhumed remains found no significant arsenic levels, and most medical historians lean toward a diagnosis of acute gastrointestinal infection, likely from contaminated food or water in a city where sanitation was notoriously poor. His brief, violent illness shows how quickly an apparently sturdy president could be overwhelmed by the same summer diseases that stalked ordinary Washington families. 25. Taylor's gastroenteritis. Explanation. For all the poison plots and shadowy suspects people like to imagine, most medical historians end up somewhere much more mundane with Zachary Taylor's final illness. When they go back to the symptom lists, doctor notes, and eyewitness descriptions, What they see looks less like a subtle poisoning and more like a violent gastrointestinal catastrophe, a sudden infection of the stomach and intestines that his doctors labeled cholera morbus. The term covered a lot of ground in the 19th century, from true cholera to severe foodborne illness. But the pattern is familiar: abrupt onset after a meal, relentless vomiting and diarrhea, cramping, dehydration, and a 5-day slide that supportive care simply couldn't turn around. Washington's water system was contaminated. Food handling was casual at best, and the city routinely saw outbreaks of dysentery and other enteric diseases during the summer. Taylor was 65, worn down by years of military service and travel, and his physicians dosed him with calomel, opiates, and bleedings that likely added strain to an already failing system. When modern clinicians look at that combination, tainted water, dense crowds, hot weather, rapid onset gastrointestinal distress, they see what we would now call acute gastroenteritis or a severe bacterial infection, not the slow, stealthy arc of arsenic or some exotic toxin. It doesn't make for a gripping murder mystery, but it fits the medical record far better than the more dramatic stories that came later. 26. Taylor's 1991 exhumation. The poisoning theory gained so much traction over the decades that it eventually left the realm of rumor and entered a Kentucky cemetery. In 1991, after years of lobbying by a persistent Taylor descendant and coverage in popular history books and documentaries, authorities approved the exhumation of Zachary Taylor's remains from his mausoleum in Louisville to settle the arsenic question scientifically. Forensic experts took small samples of hair, fingernails, and other preserved tissue, the kinds of materials most likely to hold on to heavy metals long after soft organs have decayed. The process was clinical and quiet, overseen by a medical examiner and performed with the consent of the family, then followed by reinterment with ceremony. Those samples went to a state crime lab and an outside nuclear laboratory for independent analysis. The testing teams weren't chasing vague impressions. They were looking for measurable evidence that Taylor had been exposed to significantly elevated arsenic in the final weeks or months of his life, the type of sustained dose required to support claims of deliberate poisoning. The very fact that a sitting president's body was opened more than 140 years after his death says a lot about how enduring presidential conspiracy narratives can be, and how far modern investigators are sometimes willing to go to either confirm or discard them. 27. Taylor poisoning theory ruled unlikely. The lab results from Taylor's exhumation were far less cinematic than the build-up suggested. Tests showed that he did have arsenic in his remains, but at levels consistent with what you'd expect from a 19th century American, exposed to trace amounts in food, water, medicine, and the environment, not the sky-high concentrations associated with acute or even slow deliberate poisoning. Forensic toxicologists compared the readings against known poisoning cases and environmental baselines and concluded there was no sign of a fatal dose around the time of his death. If someone had tried to kill him with arsenic, they would have needed to administer large amounts over a sustained period, leaving a chemical fingerprint that simply wasn't there. Instead, the numbers fit the background exposure pattern of an era when arsenic-containing compounds were used in pesticides, fabric dyes, and some therapeutic remedies. The medical examiner's report explicitly stated that the evidence did not support the theory that Taylor was murdered by arsenic, and subsequent reviews by independent researchers have agreed. The poisoning story continues to surface in popular retellings because it's dramatic and politically charged, but the best available forensic science points back toward the less glamorous explanation: a sudden, severe gastrointestinal illness in a city with unsafe water and limited medical understanding. 28. Millard Fillmore and the stroke. Millard Fillmore's death in 1874 was quiet enough that it rarely earns more than a line in most schoolbook timelines, but the details line up with what we now recognize as a classic cerebrovascular event. In late February of that year, the 74-year-old former president suffered what doctors at the time called a paralytic stroke, leaving him weak on one side and with difficulty swallowing and speaking. There were no CT scans, blood thinners, or clot-busting drugs in their toolkit, only rest, simple diets, and a watchful eye as they tried to guess whether he might rally. For a brief moment he seemed to improve, even managing to take some food and respond to visitors, but then he experienced another stroke that worsened his deficits and led to a slow decline over several days. He died on March 8th in Buffalo, New York, far from the White House and long after his short unelected term had ended. In an era when sudden paralysis was frequently misattributed to vague apoplexy, Fillmore's case looks to modern neurologists like a typical series of ischemic or hemorrhagic events in an elderly man with the usual vascular risks of his time. There is no serious historical debate about conspiracies or toxins here, just the familiar fragility of aging arteries, playing out in a former president who had largely slipped from national attention. 29. Fillmore's The Last of the Millard Fillmores. A small, oddly charming anecdote has clung to Millard Fillmore's memory, largely because it offers a rare scrap of personality at the edge of his otherwise subdued exit. According to a later account by his physician, as Fillmore struggled to eat after his first stroke, he was served a simple dish of warm soup or egg, managed a few bites, and is supposed to have murmured, "The nourishment is palatable," sometimes retold as, "It is the last of the Millard Fillmores," a dark little joke about his own impending end. The problem is that the sources are secondhand and written after the fact, with slight variations in wording that make historians cautious. Deathbed lines are notoriously prone to embellishment, especially for public figures whose lives didn't generate many quotable moments. Some scholars suspect the more theatrical version, the self-referential Last of the Millard Fillmores, may be a later punch-up of the plainer, "The nourishment is palatable," crafted to give a bland president a clever final bow. Either way, the story persists because it humanizes him, a man half paralyzed, aware of his condition, responding to a spoonful of food with dry understatement rather than drama. Whether perfectly accurate or lightly polished, it's one of the few details that people remember about how Fillmore actually met his end. 30. Franklin Pierce's cirrhosis. Franklin Pierce's final years make for one of the bleakest arcs of any former president, not because of a single shocking event, but because of a slow unraveling that medicine now reads clearly as alcoholic liver disease. Pierce left office in 1857 unpopular and politically isolated, haunted by personal losses that predated his presidency, including the horrific death of his last surviving son in a train accident just weeks before his inauguration. Friends and contemporaries repeatedly described him as drinking heavily, sometimes to the point of public embarrassment, and his wife's long-term illness added another weight to a man who had already struggled with depression. By the late 1860s, observers noted that Pierce was frail, jaundiced, and frequently unwell, classic external signs of cirrhosis, where scar tissue slowly replaces healthy liver tissue after years of sustained damage. When he fell seriously ill in 1869 at his home in Concord, New Hampshire, his doctors described gastrointestinal bleeding, profound weakness and fluid accumulation, symptoms consistent with advanced liver failure, and its complications. He died on October 8th of that year at 64. There was no dramatic assassination, no sudden epidemic sweeping through the capital, just the cumulative toll of grief and alcohol on a vital organ that quietly keeps the body in balance until, little by little, it can't. In Pierce's case, his death underlines how the emotional aftershocks of the presidency could sink a man long after he left Washington's stage. 31. Pierce's son and the train wreck. Franklin Pierce's decline didn't begin with the bottle. It began with a railroad car torn open like a toy and a child's body pulled from the wreckage. In January 1853, just weeks before he was sworn in, Pierce, his wife Jane, and their 11-year-old son Benny were riding a train near Andover, Massachusetts, when a broken axle sent their car off the tracks. The adults survived with bruises and shock, but Benny was thrown against the interior and killed instantly, his skull crushed in front of his parents. For a couple who had already buried two younger sons, the loss of the last surviving child felt like a specific kind of cosmic cruelty, and Jane interpreted it as divine punishment for Pierce's political ambition. She withdrew further into grief and religious anxiety, while Pierce, outwardly composed at his inauguration, was privately shattered. That image of a president-elect cradling his dead son in the snow beside overturned train cars never really left him, and contemporaries believed it fed the melancholy and drinking that would eventually erode his health and help speed him toward the cirrhosis that killed him years later in New Hampshire. 32. Pierce's solitary final months. By the time Franklin Pierce's liver was failing, the man who had once occupied the most public office in the country was living almost like a ghost in his own town. After the Civil War, his outspoken criticism of Lincoln and the Union war effort made him deeply unpopular in the North, and many former allies kept their distance. Jane Pierce died in 1863, removing one of the last anchors in his life, and his Concord home grew quieter as his social circle shrank. In 1869, when his health sharply declined, doctors visited the house and noted his swelling abdomen, weakness, and episodes of vomiting blood, signs of advanced portal hypertension and esophageal varices that modern hepatologists recognize all too well. But there were no large crowds gathering outside, no throngs of politicians rushing to his bedside, just a handful of friends and a few relatives cycling through the parlor while he drifted in and out of consciousness. Local newspapers recorded his passing in respectful but muted tones. Washington essentially looked the other way. Pierce died in the same small New England city where he had started his career, a former president felled not by war or conspiracy, but by years of private sorrow and alcohol, largely forgotten by a nation focused on Reconstruction. 33. Buchanan's chronic illness before Wheatland. James Buchanan's death from respiratory failure at Wheatland didn't come out of nowhere. It rode in on a body already worn down by years of chronic disease. Even while in office, Buchanan complained frequently of digestive troubles and episodes of what his doctors called rheumatism, a catch-all term that probably covered inflammatory joint pain and maybe even early autoimmune issues. He had an odd sideways head tilt and visual complaints that some modern physicians suspect might have been related to a long-standing neurologic or muscular condition. By the late 1860s, after the stress of secession and the Civil War years spent under a cloud of blame, his stamina was clearly diminished. Friends visiting Wheatland described him as easily winded, with bouts of coughing and spells of weakness after even modest exertion. 19th century medicine didn't have the language we use today. No talk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, congestive heart failure, or post-infectious scarring from repeated bronchitis, but the pattern fits an aging man with compromised lungs and circulation. When an acute infection finally hit him in 1868, it didn't meet a healthy system. It met a body that had already been fighting a low-grade battle on multiple fronts, making the final respiratory collapse much harder to survive. 34. Buchanan's quiet death at Wheatland. Unlike presidents who died in boarding houses, hotels, or distant cities, James Buchanan's story ended in the red brick mansion he had chosen for retirement, far from any public stage. Wheatland, outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, had been his refuge both before and after the White House, a place where he could host small gatherings, walk the grounds, and try to rebuild his reputation in controlled private conversations. In May 1868, he was struck by what his doctor called intermittent dysentery that progressed to what they labeled rheumatic gout of the intestines and heart, terms that probably masked a combination of gastrointestinal infection and systemic inflammation. The illness soon settled in his chest. He developed labored breathing and episodes of what we'd now describe as acute respiratory distress. There were no grand deathbed speeches, no public bulletins every hour, just local physicians, a few household staff, and some close associates moving quietly through shaded rooms as the former president struggled to draw air. He died on June 1, 1868, in his bedroom at Wheatland, officially of respiratory failure, with his last hours witnessed by a tiny circle of people rather than a nation. His funeral, though respectful and attended by local dignitaries, never approached the scale of the state funerals given to some of his successors. His final days remained essentially domestic, almost ordinary, for a man who had once watched a country slide toward war from the center of power. 35. Lincoln's head wound at Ford's Theater. Abraham Lincoln's death began with a single lead ball fired into the back of his head while he was watching a play, and the medical record around that moment is unusually detailed. On the night of April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box at Ford's Theater, pressed a .44 caliber Derringer to Lincoln's head just behind his left ear, and pulled the trigger. The ball fractured the occipital bone, passed through the brain, and lodged behind the right eye, a trajectory later confirmed by physicians who examined the wound and by the autopsy performed the next day. Army Surgeon Charles Leal, one of the first doctors to reach Lincoln, found that the president was limp, breathing noisily, and completely unresponsive, with evidence of paralysis on one side. Leal removed clotted blood from the wound with his finger to relieve pressure, a standard but now primitive-seeming intervention, and concluded that the injury was mortal and that there was no hope of surgical repair with the tools and knowledge of the time. Lincoln never regained consciousness at any point, not in the theater box, not in the street, not in the boarding house, and the physicians agreed that even in a modern neurosurgical unit, a wound passing through so much critical brain tissue would be considered almost universally fatal. 36. The Peterson House and Lincoln's 9-hour vigil. Once the doctors realized Abraham Lincoln was still breathing but beyond rescue, their challenge was strangely practical: find somewhere nearby where he could die in relative quiet. Moving him back to the White House over Washington's rutted nighttime streets was out of the question. The jostling of a carriage ride could have killed him even faster, and the distance was simply too great for a man with that level of brain injury. So they carried him out of Ford's Theater, across 10th Street, and into the first suitable house they could find, the Peterson House, a modest brick boarding house whose back bedroom would become his final room. They laid him diagonally across a small bed because he was too tall to fit lengthwise, propped him to ease his breathing, and then settled into a long, grim vigil. For roughly 9 hours, through the small hours of April 15th, cabinet members, military officers, and family came and went in hushed shifts while doctors periodically cleared blood from the wound and noted his slowing pulse and increasingly shallow respirations. Mary Todd Lincoln entered and left repeatedly, overcome by grief. Robert Todd Lincoln stood by quietly. There were no attempts at heroic surgery, just continuous observation of a man whose body still labored while his consciousness was gone. At 7:22 a.m., when his heart finally stopped, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton is said to have remarked, "Now he belongs to the ages." Another deathbed line whose exact wording is mildly contested, but whose sentiment captures the strange, almost suspended night that separated one gunshot at a theater from a nation waking up to the news that its president had died in a rented room across the street. 37. Lincoln's official autopsy. For a president who died in a cramped bedroom across from a theater, Abraham Lincoln left behind one of the most formally documented death records of his era. The morning after the assassination, his body was taken to the White House, and in a second-floor guest room, Army surgeons performed a full autopsy, something that had never been done so systematically on a sitting president. They traced the bullet's exact path from the entry point behind his left ear, through the brain, to where it lodged behind his right eye, carefully removing bone fragments and recording what they saw. The doctors noted the damage to the left side of his brain, the clots, the torn tissue, and the pooling of blood that had pressed on critical centers controlling breathing and heart function. Their handwritten report described the caliber and type of weapon, the trajectory, and the cause of death in language that reads almost clinical by modern standards. Pieces of Lincoln's skull and brain were preserved for study, some kept by the Army Medical Museum as teaching specimens, a practice that feels unsettling now, but was common in 19th century pathology. Those detailed notes, sketches, and preserved fragments gave later historians and neurosurgeons a rare chance to reconstruct exactly how a Civil War-era gunshot to the head killed a president, turning Lincoln's autopsy into one of the earliest deeply documented medical case studies of a presidential death rather than just a set of rumors and recollections. 38. Lincoln's funeral train. Once Lincoln's body was prepared and embalmed, the question became not just how to bury him, but how an entire grieving country could say goodbye. The answer was a funeral train, a slow, looping journey that would carry his coffin from Washington back to Springfield, Illinois, roughly reversing the route he had taken to the capital 4 years earlier. Over nearly 2 weeks in late April and early May 1865, the special train stopped in major cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, and Chicago, where the coffin was unloaded and placed in public halls for viewings that drew hundreds of thousands of mourners. The body was repeatedly re-embalmed and cosmetically adjusted along the way because the combination of time, motion, and early preservation techniques made it difficult to maintain his appearance. Each city staged its own procession, blending local customs with a broader sense of national loss, so the funeral effectively became a rolling series of state funerals stitched together by rails. As the train passed through small towns without stopping, people lined the tracks in the dark and the rain, holding lanterns, flags, or just standing silently as the cars rolled by. By the time Lincoln's coffin finally reached Springfield for burial at Oak Ridge Cemetery, millions of Americans had physically watched that black draped train move through their landscape, a traveling symbol of how a single death was being woven into a shared national memory. 39. Andrew Johnson's stroke visit. If Lincoln's final hours were spent surrounded by cabinet secretaries and generals, Andrew Johnson's last days were far more domestic and far from Washington. In July 1875, 10 years after leaving the presidency under the cloud of impeachment and political battles, Johnson traveled to Tennessee to visit his daughter Mary in the small town of Carter Station. He was 72, still arguing about politics in letters and conversations, but physically worn by years of stress, alcohol, and chronic health complaints. On the evening of July 28th, he reportedly complained of feeling unwell and experienced sudden dizziness and weakness, classic warning signs of a cerebrovascular event that his 19th century doctors could only describe as paralysis. He collapsed shortly afterward and was moved to a bed, where local physicians were summoned but had essentially no effective tools beyond observation and small interventions like bleeding or purgatives, which did nothing to reverse a major stroke. Johnson drifted in and out of consciousness over the next day. Partially paralyzed, his speech impaired, the damage likely centered in the brain's blood vessels that modern neurologists can map, but his doctors could only guess at. He died in that modest Tennessee home on July 31st, not in the capital city where he had once presided over Reconstruction, but in a relative's house, his passing noted in the papers but without the national pageantry that had followed Lincoln's assassination or would follow later presidential deaths. 40. Johnson buried with the Constitution. For a man whose presidency was defined by constant battles over the meaning of the Constitution, Andrew Johnson's burial carried a symbolic gesture that was hard to miss. When he died, his body was taken to Greenville, Tennessee, the small town that had been his home base before and after the White House, and plans were made for him to be interred on a hill that would later become the Andrew Johnson National Cemetery. Johnson had left instructions that he be wrapped in an American flag and buried with a copy of the Constitution as a kind of final statement about how he saw himself, not as an accidental successor to Lincoln, but as a defender of his own interpretation of constitutional limits and presidential power. According to contemporary accounts, a pocket-sized copy of the document was placed under his head in the coffin, effectively serving as a pillow made of paper law. That choice reflected both his stubbornness and his self-image after leaving office, when he insisted he had been impeached not for wrongdoing, but for resisting what he considered congressional overreach. Whatever one thinks of his policies or his clashes with radical Republicans, the image is striking. A former tailor who rose from poverty to the presidency, lying beneath a flag he had once fought to keep intact, his head resting on the charter of government that had defined and nearly destroyed his political career. 41. Ulysses S. Grant's throat cancer. Ulysses S. Grant's death in 1885 didn't come from a battlefield wound or an assassin's bullet, but from a slow, painful disease that modern medicine now knows is strongly linked to tobacco. For most of his adult life, Grant was rarely seen without a cigar. Admirers and political supporters showered him with boxes of them, and estimates of his daily consumption range from a handful to several dozen, depending on the source. In the summer of 1884, he began complaining of persistent throat pain and difficulty swallowing, initially dismissed as a bad cold or irritation from a hot bite of food, but the symptoms lingered and worsened. By that fall, a New York physician examined him and found an ulcerated lesion on the back of his tongue and throat, which later consultations identified as a malignant tumor, what we would now label a squamous cell carcinoma of the upper airway. At the time, surgical options were crude and dangerous, and there was no radiation or chemotherapy to shrink or control the cancer. So treatment focused on pain relief and trying to maintain nutrition as swallowing became harder and every sip of water burned. Grant lost weight, his voice grew weaker, and the once commanding general was reduced to writing his thoughts on paper when speaking became too exhausting. The cancer eventually spread and obstructed more of his throat, leading to progressive debility and the near starvation that, together with the tumor burden, finally ended his life at a cottage on Mount Macedon in July 1885. 42. Grant finished his memoirs while dying. What makes Ulysses S. Grant's final illness especially haunting is not just the cancer, but the race he ran against it with a pen in his hand. Financially ruined by a Wall Street swindle in the early 1880s, Grant suddenly found himself facing not only a terminal diagnosis, but the prospect of leaving his wife Julia and their family nearly destitute. When Mark Twain and others suggested he write his memoirs, Grant initially hesitated, worrying that his writing might not sell, but the pressure of his illness and his debts pushed him to accept. Throughout the brutal winter and spring of 1884 to 1885, he wrote for hours each day while sitting in a chair or propped in bed, often wrapped in shawls, unable to tolerate solid food, and in constant pain that laudanum and cocaine-based throat sprays could only partially dull. His doctors and family described how he would cough, spit blood, rest briefly, and then pick up the pencil again, determined to finish the story of his life, and especially his Civil War campaigns. The manuscript grew to 2 volumes, remarkable for their clarity and lack of self-pity, and he completed the final pages just days before his strength failed completely. Grant died on July 23, 1885, and when the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant were published posthumously, they became both a literary and financial success, earning enough in royalties to secure his family's future. His last great campaign wasn't on a battlefield. It was a quiet, drawn-out battle against time and pain, fought with sentences instead of soldiers, one just ahead of the disease that claimed him. 43. Hayes's sudden collapse after a walk after Ulysses S. Grant's drawn-out struggle with cancer, Rutherford B. Hayes's death almost felt understated in comparison. A quiet end for a man who had presided over one of the most disputed elections in American history. In January 1893, more than a decade after leaving the White House, Hayes was living at his beloved Spiegel Grove estate in Fremont, Ohio, spending his days reading, managing charitable projects, and taking regular walks on the grounds. On the evening of January 17th, after returning from one of those walks in cold winter air, he reportedly complained of shortness of breath and chest discomfort, symptoms that today would immediately raise alarms for a heart problem. Within hours he collapsed, likely from what his doctors described simply as a heart trouble, language that modern cardiologists interpret as a probable heart attack or acute heart failure in a man already known to have recurring chest pains. Without electrocardiograms, clot-busting drugs, or emergency surgery, all his 19th century physicians could do was watch, offer stimulants, and hope, but his heart continued to fail. Hayes died that night at age 70, not in a capital city or a hospital, but in the Ohio home he loved. His passing initially overshadowed in the national press by other events, but later remembered as one of the more medically straightforward presidential deaths, a sudden likely coronary event ending a long, largely peaceful retirement. 44. Hayes's long, uneventful post-presidency, unlike some presidents, whose final years were consumed by scandal, poverty, or bitter political feuds, Rutherford B. Hayes moved into a post-presidency that was long, relatively calm, and quietly busy. After leaving office in 1881, he returned to Spiegel Grove and made a deliberate choice not to chase another role in Washington, declining offers and resisting any temptation to become a behind-the-scenes power broker. Instead, he poured his energy into causes that interested him more than headlines: civil service reform, prison reform, education funding, especially for Black Americans in the South, and support for libraries and schools in his home state. Hayes used his stature to raise money and attention, served on boards, gave speeches, and wrote letters, but rarely waded into partisan fights in a way that would drag him back into the political storms of Reconstruction. His health gradually reflected his age, with reports of fatigue and intermittent heart symptoms. Yet he remained active enough that his sudden collapse in 1893 took many acquaintances by surprise. There were no dramatic accusations surrounding his bedside, no contested autopsy reports, no whispered conspiracy theories. He died in his own room, was honored with a funeral that was dignified but not extravagant, and was buried first in Oakwood Cemetery and later reinterred at Spiegel Grove. Compared with the spectacle around Lincoln's train, or Grant's memoir-writing vigil, Hayes's end almost disappeared into the background, a reminder that some presidential deaths came with more quiet than controversy. 45. Garfield lived for months after the shooting if Rutherford B. Hayes slipped away quickly. His successor, James A. Garfield, endured one of the longest, most agonizing death spirals of any American president. On July 2, 1881, just a few months into his term, Garfield was shot at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C., by Charles Guiteau, a disappointed office seeker convinced that killing the president would somehow save the Republican Party. One bullet grazed Garfield's arm, the other entered his back and lodged somewhere deep inside his body. He collapsed, but did not die on the spot, and early reports suggested he might recover, because his vital organs didn't appear to have been immediately destroyed. For weeks, and then months, he lingered, drifting between periods of improvement and terrifying setbacks as fever, pain, and exhaustion wore him down. He was moved from a room near the station to the White House, where a team of doctors watched his pulse, his breathing, and his appetite, documenting how his weight fell and his strength slowly ebbed away. Garfield survived 79 days after the shooting, long enough for the country to follow his condition in daily bulletins, long enough for his case to become less a simple gunshot wound and more a complex medical catastrophe, whose outcome would depend less on the bullet itself than on what his doctors did trying to find it. 46. Infection played a bigger role than the bullet. The central medical mystery of James Garfield's death isn't whether the bullet was dangerous, but whether it was actually the main killer. Many modern physicians who have studied his case believe it was not. Contemporary accounts describe how his lead doctor, D. Willard Bliss, and others repeatedly probed the wound with unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments, ignoring or dismissing Joseph Lister's new ideas about germs and antiseptic technique that were already gaining ground in Europe. Each attempt to locate the bullet turned the wound into an open gateway for bacteria. And over time, Garfield developed classic signs of widespread infection: persistent high fevers, pus-filled abscesses deep in his body, and a steadily worsening septic state that no one at the time could adequately treat. Autopsy findings later showed not only damage from the original gunshot, but also a maze of infected tracts and pockets of pus, particularly in the area where his doctors had been most aggressive with their explorations. Some historians and physicians now argue that if Garfield had simply been placed in a clean bed, given basic supportive care, and left without invasive interference, he might well have survived with a lodged but stable bullet, something other gunshot patients of the era did. Instead, the combination of ignorance about germ theory and an almost desperate determination to do something probably turned a survivable injury into a fatal infection. 47. The desperate search for Garfield's bullet, the story of Garfield's wound care, reads like a catalog of well-intentioned but damaging mistakes, and at the center of it all was the obsession with finding the bullet. Almost from the moment he was carried away from the train station platform, his doctors were convinced that locating and removing the projectile would be the key to saving him, even though they lacked precise imaging, sterile operating rooms, or even detailed anatomical consensus on its path. Bliss and his colleagues repeatedly inserted fingers and metal probes into the wound, guessing at the direction the bullet had taken, each attempt driving contaminants deeper. At one point, Alexander Graham Bell brought an experimental metal detecting device to the White House, hoping to use his new technology to locate the bullet without more cutting. The test produced confusing results, partly because the bed's metal springs interfered, and partly because the doctors had insisted he only scanned the wrong side of Garfield's body based on their own mistaken assumptions. The bullet remained in place until the autopsy, when surgeons discovered it had traveled in a curved path and come to rest behind his pancreas, not where Bliss had thought at all. In the process of searching, they had created multiple false tracks, drained his strength, and increased his exposure to infection, turning the hunt for the bullet into a tragic example of how doing more can sometimes mean doing worse. 48. Moving Garfield to the seaside for relief as the sweltering Washington summer of 1881 wore on, James Garfield's sick room in the White House became not only a medical space but a symbol of national anxiety, and his doctors grew increasingly worried that the oppressive heat and poor ventilation were hastening his decline. In early September, with his weight dangerously low and his spirits sinking, they agreed to an extraordinary plan: move the gravely ill president out of the Capitol to a cottage on the New Jersey shore, in the hope that cooler air and a quieter environment might provide some relief. A special train was arranged. Tracks were hastily laid almost to the door of the seaside house in Long Branch, and Garfield, weak and racked with infection, was carefully transported north, an operation that itself carried serious risks for someone in his condition. For a brief moment, the gamble seemed to help. He reportedly enjoyed listening to the waves and feeling the cooler breeze, and his doctors noted slight improvements in comfort, if not in underlying health. But the infections and internal damage were already too advanced. Within weeks of his arrival, his condition worsened again, with renewed pain, high fevers, and signs of internal bleeding or organ failure. Garfield died there on September 19th, far from the city where he had been shot, his final days shaped by a 19th-century belief in the restorative power of sea air that could soothe symptoms but not undo months of internal devastation. 49. Chester A. Arthur's hidden kidney disease while Garfield's suffering unfolded in public. Chester A. Arthur's decline played out in almost deliberate quiet, hidden behind a wall of formality and denial that fit his reserved personality and the era's limited medical language. Even before he unexpectedly became president after Garfield's death, Arthur had been diagnosed with what doctors then called Bright's disease, a chronic inflammation of the kidneys that caused fatigue, swelling, and high blood pressure long before anyone understood the full mechanics of renal failure. He kept the diagnosis close, sharing details with only a small circle, and continued to present a polished image in public, attending receptions, entertaining dignitaries, and trying to rebuild trust in the office that had been thrown into chaos by assassination. Behind the scenes, though, he grew increasingly exhausted, sometimes retreating early from social events, canceling trips, or disappearing from view for rest that contemporaries described politely but vaguely. In an age before dialysis, transplant surgery, or modern blood tests, there was little his physicians could do beyond recommending diet changes, tonics, and rest, all of which only slowed rather than stopped the progression. By the time he left office in 1885, his energy was clearly diminished. He refused to run hard for another term, in part because he knew he was too ill. Over the next year, his world quietly narrowed to a New York City townhouse, short outings, and occasional visits to his club, where friends noticed his increasing frailty but rarely heard him complain. Arthur died there in November 1886 at just 57. His official cause of death listed as a stroke, but almost certainly rooted in years of uncontrolled kidney disease that he had carefully kept from public scrutiny, leaving historians with only scattered notes and a sense of a presidency shadowed by an illness most voters never knew existed. 50. Arthur destroyed his personal papers. Arthur's instinct for privacy and life extended all the way into his last days, shaping not only how he handled his illness, but how much of himself he left to history. As his Bright's disease worsened and he realized he might not have long, he quietly began a methodical purge of his personal papers, a firelit process that has frustrated biographers ever since. Friends and family later recalled that he spent hours going through correspondence, notes, and official documents he had brought home from the White House, separating out what could be saved for the public record and what he preferred never to see daylight. The material he chose to burn likely included letters about appointments, internal political struggles, private reflections on Garfield's assassination, and candid assessments of allies and rivals, exactly the sort of first-person evidence historians rely on to reconstruct a president's inner world. In the 19th century, this wasn't entirely unusual. Many public figures believed that protecting confidences and controlling their posthumous image was more important than satisfying future curiosity. But Arthur's purge was especially thorough, leaving only a thin trail of personal writing compared with other presidents of his era. As a result, his final months are partly a blank space. We know he was in pain, that his kidneys were failing, and that he remained outwardly dignified, but we don't have his own words describing what it felt like to face a shortened life after unexpectedly inheriting the nation's highest office. The bonfires he fed in that New York townhouse didn't change the medical facts of his death, but they did narrow the window through which later generations could understand the emotional and political weight he carried as a quietly dying president. 51. Grover Cleveland's declining heart. Grover Cleveland, the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, ended his life far from the storms of Washington, but his final years were shadowed by a body that was wearing down under the combined strain of age, size, and earlier health scares. Decades before his death, he had undergone a secret and risky surgery to remove a cancerous growth from his mouth on a yacht, an operation hidden from the public to avoid panic about the stability of his leadership. He recovered from that episode, but it revealed how carefully presidents and their doctors might manage news about serious illness. As he aged in retirement in Princeton, New Jersey, Cleveland developed what his physicians described as heart weakness and digestive troubles, vague phrases that today likely translate to coronary artery disease and chronic gastrointestinal issues. He was a large man with a history of rich food, cigars, and limited exercise compared with modern standards, and by his early 70s he experienced periods of breathlessness, fatigue, and swelling, classic signs of a heart under strain. Treatment options in 1908 were minimal. No statins, no blood thinners, no bypass surgery, only rest, dietary advice, and digitalis-type medications that offered limited help. In his final days, Cleveland reportedly complained of severe abdominal pain and shortness of breath before suffering a catastrophic heart attack, what doctors then called apoplexy of the heart. He died in June 1908 at age 71, reportedly telling his physician, "I have tried so hard to do right," a quiet personal statement that contrasted with the public opacity around his earlier cancer surgery and reminds us how much of presidential health in that era lived behind curtains of polite understatement and carefully chosen words. 52. Benjamin Harrison's fatal influenza. Benjamin Harrison's death shows how a seemingly ordinary seasonal illness could still be deadly for an older former president in the pre-antibiotic age. After leaving office, Harrison returned to Indianapolis, resumed his law practice, remarried, and lived a relatively quiet life, giving occasional speeches and writing about constitutional issues, but largely stepping away from daily political battles. By the winter of 1901, he was 67 and not in especially poor health for his age, but like many older adults, he was vulnerable to respiratory infections that had no real cure at the time. In late February, he caught what was described as influenza, an illness that in that era often meant days of fever, chills, coughing, and exhaustion without the benefit of antiviral drugs, oxygen therapy, or modern intensive care. For some patients, the virus itself was survivable, but the real danger came from secondary bacterial pneumonia setting in on lungs already weakened and inflamed. That's what happened to Harrison. His flu progressed to bronchial and then full-blown pneumonia, filling his lungs with fluid and making each breath a struggle. Doctors tried the usual remedies of the day: mustard plasters, stimulants, oxygen-containing inhalations, but there was no antibiotic to stop the bacterial overgrowth, no ventilator to support his breathing while his body fought back. After several days of worsening shortness of breath and high fever, he slipped into semi-consciousness and died on March 13, 1901, at home in Indianapolis. His death certificate lists pneumonia as the cause, but the chain began with a routine flu infection, a reminder of how even now familiar illnesses once carried a far greater risk for anyone, even a former commander-in-chief, who happened to be in the wrong age or health category when a virus came through town. 53. William McKinley survived the shooting at first. When President William McKinley was shot in Buffalo in September 1901, initial reactions were not filled with the immediate dread that surrounded Lincoln or later Kennedy, in part because he didn't collapse into obvious irreversible crisis right away. The assassin, Leon Kogos, fired 2 shots at close range while McKinley was greeting visitors at the Pan American Exposition. One bullet grazed his chest, and the other entered his abdomen, disappearing into his body. McKinley staggered but remained conscious, telling his aides not to let the crowd hurt his attacker and asking about his wife, an almost reflexive gesture of calm that shaped early newspaper coverage. He was quickly taken to a nearby hospital, where doctors performed emergency surgery to explore and repair what they could see of the damage. They removed the obvious accessible bullet and closed the visible stomach wound, and afterward his vital signs initially looked promising by the standards of the day. He was awake, could speak in short sentences, and his pulse and temperature seemed reasonably stable. For nearly a week, official bulletins were cautiously optimistic, reporting that the president was resting comfortably, eating small amounts of food, and showing what they interpreted as signs of gradual recovery. The country exhaled slightly, reassured that, unlike Garfield's agonizing months-long decline, this gunshot might resolve into a story of survival. But beneath those hopeful updates, his body was already developing a slow, deep infection in tissues the surgeons had not fully visualized or cleansed. What looked like improvement on the surface masks the beginning of peritonitis and gangrene, conditions that 19th century medicine had few tools to diagnose early or treat effectively. 54. McKinley's poor operating conditions. One reason McKinley's surgery failed to prevent his death wasn't necessarily the skill of the doctors themselves, but the tools, environment, and knowledge they lacked. The operation at the Buffalo Hospital took place in a building that wasn't designed as a modern surgical theater. Lighting was poor enough that a local doctor reportedly had to angle mirrors and open windows to get better visibility, and there was no electric illumination focused on the wound the way there would be even a few decades later. Portable X-ray machines existed in 1901, but the best available device arrived late and couldn't clearly locate the remaining bullet, leaving surgeons to rely on their hands and eyes in an abdomen already filling with blood and damaged tissue. Antiseptic technique was recognized by then, and the surgeons did wash and use sterilized instruments, but their ability to assess deeper injuries was limited without modern imaging, lab tests, or a clear understanding of how quickly abdominal infections could spread. The lead surgeon, Matthew Mann, was a respected local gynecologist, not a trauma specialist, simply because he was the most experienced surgeon on hand when the president arrived, and there was no easy way to bring in distant experts quickly. In the days that followed, doctors interpreted McKinley's relatively low pain levels and initially stable pulse as good signs, unaware that gangrene could quietly advance in tissues around the stomach and pancreas, while surface wounds appeared to heal. By the time his fever rose and his heart began to fail, the underlying infection and tissue death were beyond anything early 20th century medicine could reverse. McKinley died 8 days after the shooting, not from immediate blood loss on the exposition floor, but from a cascade of complications shaped by an operating room that simply couldn't see or reach what was killing him. 55. McKinley's gangrene and silent peritonitis. McKinley's apparent recovery hit a slower, more merciless enemy than the bullets themselves. Infection that 19th century medicine couldn't really see coming. In the days after his surgery, doctors proudly reported that his incision looked clean, his pulse was steady, and his spirits were good, reassuring a nation desperate to believe that the worst was over. But inside his abdomen, the torn stomach and nearby tissues were quietly being colonized by bacteria the surgeons hadn't fully washed out, in an era before antibiotics, CT scans, or blood cultures could warn anyone what was happening. The bullet that doctors never found had passed through clothing, skin, and organs, pulling fabric fibers and microbes into deep spaces where they could fester. Gradually, the lining of his abdomen became inflamed, a condition known as peritonitis, and parts of his internal organs began to die, turning gangrenous even as the external wound appeared to heal. His temperature crept up, his appetite faded, and he slipped from hopeful conversation into a kind of exhausted resignation, still telling visitors not to blame anyone, but showing the classic signs of sepsis that his physicians misread as temporary setbacks. By the time they realized that gangrene had developed around his wounds, there was no realistic way to reopen his abdomen, clean out the infection, and expect him to survive the shock. The combination of untreated peritonitis and spreading gangrene overwhelmed his heart and circulation, leading to a quiet collapse that had little to do with dramatic blood loss and everything to do with microscopic invaders no one could stop. McKinley's death certificate named gangrene and systemic infection as the final blow, turning what had looked like a survivable shooting into another lesson in how invisible post-operative infections could undo even the best intentions of early modern surgeons. 56. McKinley's 8-day decline. McKinley's assassination is often remembered as a sudden event, but medically his death unfolded over 8 long, deceptive days. On the afternoon of the shooting, observers saw him stay calm, stand upright with help, and ride to the hospital conscious, which made the attack feel less immediately fatal than the theater horror of Lincoln or the platform chaos of Garfield. After surgery, he spoke with his wife, dictated small messages, and listened to updates about the country's response, encouraging everyone around him by insisting he would recover. Newspapers printed optimistic bulletins about his pulse and temperature, and some editorials prematurely celebrated modern surgery as having saved another president from an assassin's bullet. The public was told that his worst danger passed in the first 24 hours, reinforcing the idea that if a patient survived the initial trauma, survival overall was likely. In reality, abdominal gunshot wounds in that era were time bombs, with infection typically declaring itself days later, after the body had already been weakened by shock and blood loss. Around day 5, McKinley's condition subtly turned, his fever climbed, his heart began to labor, and his mental clarity faded, though official statements still tried to sound hopeful. On day 7, doctors privately acknowledged that peritonitis and gangrene had taken hold, but there was nothing meaningful they could do except manage his pain and watch his vital signs fail. He died early in the morning of September 14th, 8 days after the attack, long enough that some Americans had already started to imagine his return to Washington. That delay is part of why his death can feel historically blurred, neither instantaneous martyrdom nor months-long spectacle, but a slow, drawn-out decline that turned hope into shock over the course of a single restless week. 57. Theodore Roosevelt's pulmonary embolism. Theodore Roosevelt, the strenuous life president who charged up San Juan Hill and explored uncharted rivers, died lying quietly in bed. By 1919, his body carried the cost of decades of exertion, malaria from the Amazon, lingering effects of tropical infections, injuries from boxing and judo, and chronic inflammatory conditions that left him increasingly short of breath. In the months before his death at Sagamore Hill, his Oyster Bay home, Roosevelt had been weakened by a serious bout of inflammatory rheumatism, what today might be grouped under autoimmune or arthritic disorders, and he spent long stretches confined to his room. On the night of January 5th, he went to sleep after reading and dictating some letters, complaining only of mild discomfort in his legs, something he'd experienced before without urgent concern. In the early hours of January 6th, a clot most likely formed in a vein, possibly in his leg or pelvis, broke free, traveled through his bloodstream, and lodged in the arteries of his lungs, a classic pulmonary embolism. Such blockages can cause sudden collapse, sharp chest pain, or, as seems to have happened with Roosevelt, rapid heart failure during sleep, with little time for conscious suffering or any chance for intervention. His valet found him unresponsive in the morning, and doctors later concluded that he had died in his sleep, his heart simply stopping under the strain of the clot. For a man known for relentless activity, it was a paradoxically still ending, caused not by bullets or battlefield wounds, but by a common vascular event that continues to threaten people today, especially those with reduced mobility, chronic inflammation, or a history of serious illness. 58. Roosevelt's quiet end. After a strenuous life, Roosevelt built a public identity around motion, hiking, riding, hunting, speaking, pushing his body as hard as his politics. That's why the circumstances of his death feel so strangely out of character. No crowded rally, no dramatic collapse on an expedition, just an aging former president drifting off to sleep in a familiar bedroom overlooking Long Island trees. In the last years of his life, the gap between his vigorous image and his physical reality widened. He walked with more difficulty, endured bouts of pain that confined him to chairs instead of saddles, and relied increasingly on others to help him navigate stairs and long distances. Yet he still projected energy in public, delivering fiery speeches, writing strong-worded essays, and keeping up a volume of correspondence that suggested an undimmed mind even as his body slowed. Friends and family noticed the contrast. A man who had once bounded into rooms now sometimes eased himself down carefully, catching his breath between sentences. When the pulmonary embolism struck and his heart failed, newspapers reported the news with headlines that emphasized the gentleness of his passing. "The old lion is dead," one friend supposedly said. "He died in his sleep." There were no drawn-out deathbed scenes, no public medical bulletins dissecting every symptom, just a quiet household informed that the 70-year-old patriarch would not be coming down to breakfast. For a president who had survived an assassination attempt earlier in life, famously finishing a speech with a bullet lodged in his chest, this soft, undramatic exit underscored a simple truth. Even the most forceful personalities cannot dictate the terms of their final moments, and sometimes the body closes the story in a whisper rather than a roar. 59. William Howard Taft's long battle with heart disease. William Howard Taft's death in 1930 was not a sudden surprise so much as the final chapter of a long-running struggle with his own cardiovascular system. Taft had been a large man throughout his adult life, with weight that fluctuated but often climbed to levels that put continuous strain on his heart, blood vessels, and joints in an era with little structured guidance on diet, exercise, or metabolic health. During and after his presidency, he experienced episodes of fatigue, shortness of breath, and swelling in his legs, signs that today would immediately raise concerns about heart failure and high blood pressure. He did make efforts to lose weight and improve his health. In one period, he followed a medically supervised diet and shed significant pounds, but the underlying damage to his cardiovascular system had already begun. By the time he was serving as Chief Justice of the United States, friends and colleagues noticed that he moved more slowly, sometimes dozed during proceedings, and occasionally complained of chest discomfort and exhaustion after even modest exertion. Doctors of the 1920s described his condition with terms like myocardial degeneration and arteriosclerosis, language that reflected a general recognition that his heart muscle and arteries were deteriorating, but without the precise diagnostic categories we use now. In early 1930, his symptoms intensified. He became weaker, lost his appetite, and struggled with fluid retention, a sign that his heart could no longer pump efficiently. On March 8, 1930, He died at his Washington home, the official cause listed as complications of heart disease and high blood pressure, not a single dramatic event, but an accumulation of years of cardiovascular strain, finally reaching a point his body could no longer compensate for. 60. Taft. As the only president, Chief Justice Taft's death closed a uniquely shaped public life. No other American has ever sat both in the Oval Office and at the head of the Supreme Court. He had always dreamed more of judicial work than of politics, and after a sometimes reluctant presidency, his appointment as Chief Justice in 1921 felt to him like a return to his true vocation rather than a demotion. For nearly a decade, he presided over a court that modernized its procedures, gained a new building, and clarified several areas of federal law, all while his health steadily declined behind the dignified black robe. Colleagues and journalists saw an aging figure whose bulk and fatigue contrasted sharply with the crisp authority his position required, yet intellectually he remained engaged, still writing opinions and shaping internal debates. When he finally resigned from the court in February 1930, just weeks before his death, it was largely because he recognized that his physical weakness was beginning to interfere with his duties, a rare instance of a high official voluntarily stepping down for health reasons without external pressure. His passing a month later marked the end, not just of a man, but of a rare constitutional experiment, the same individual steering both the executive branch and, years later, the judiciary. Taft's combined roles mean that his cardiovascular decline affected two branches of government across different eras, first as an often tired president, and later as a slowing Chief Justice. When he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the first presidents to be interred there, his grave quietly symbolized that dual service, a reminder that the strains of public life can echo across decades and across the very structure of the government itself. 61. Woodrow Wilson's crippling stroke in office. Woodrow Wilson didn't leave the presidency as a fully functioning man. His body essentially failed while he still sat in power. In October 1919, as he pushed himself on a grueling cross-country tour to sell the League of Nations, his already fragile health collapsed. He'd had smaller strokes and episodes of weakness before, warnings that his doctors downplayed, but this one was catastrophic. A massive cerebral thrombosis that left his left side paralyzed and his vision and speech impaired. The public heard vague phrases like nervous exhaustion and indisposition, comforting euphemisms that concealed just how disabled the president had become. Wilson spent weeks bedridden in the White House, unable to walk unaided, suffering headaches, emotional volatility, and cognitive strain. Cabinet members and foreign leaders were told he was improving while, in reality, he could barely sign his name or read lengthy documents without fatigue. The man whose soaring rhetoric had helped reshape world diplomacy finished his term physically diminished, his brain literally scarred by interrupted blood flow. His presidency after the stroke became a strange half-light period, decisions filtered through doctors, aides, and a very protective spouse, with the full extent of his neurological damage acknowledged only decades later when medical records and memoirs surfaced. 62. Wilson's half-hidden invalid retirement. When Wilson finally left the White House in March 1921, he didn't retire to an active elder statesman life. He retreated as an invalid. He moved just a few miles away to a house on S Street in Washington, a short carriage ride that might as well have been another country given his condition. He walked with difficulty, often using a cane and the supporting arm of an attendant, his left side still weak and his gait unsteady. Visitors described him as tired, gaunt, and prematurely aged, his once booming presence reduced to halting conversation and careful, limited social appearances. He spent long hours in a wheelchair or in bed, reading in short bursts, dictating letters, and monitoring politics from afar, but with none of the physical energy to re-enter the fight. Doctors tried to protect him from stress, screening his mail and limiting who could see him, effectively wrapping the former president in a cocoon of quiet. In public, he appeared occasionally at his window, or in a car during processions, giving the impression of dignified retirement. Privately, he lived with the daily realities of chronic stroke damage, fatigue, weakness, occasional difficulty with coordination, and the knowledge that his body would never fully recover. He died less than 3 years after leaving office, in February 1924, from complications of vascular disease, his post-presidential life brief and largely spent managing the aftermath of that single devastating stroke. 63. Harding's quietly known heart problems, Warren G. Harding stepped into the White House with more cardiac risk than his smiling campaign photos ever hinted at. By the early 1920s, his physicians knew he had high blood pressure, episodes of chest discomfort, and spells of fatigue. But medical language of the time softened those realities into phrases like indigestion, nervousness, and overwork. Harding smoked cigars, dealt with significant stress, and carried himself as a hail fellow well-met politician, even when his body was signaling strain. Private notes from his doctors suggested concerns about his heart and circulatory system, but publicly they reassured reporters that the president was fundamentally sound. In that era, heart disease was poorly understood and often treated with rest rather than specific interventions. There were no statins, no beta blockers, no angioplasty, just vague advice and wishful thinking. Harding pushed himself anyway, keeping a busy schedule of speeches, meetings, and travel, determined to project vigor after the turmoil of World War I and the Wilson years. When he complained of pain or fatigue, it was attributed to the burdens of office, the press of paperwork, or simple digestion issues, not as warning flares from a stressed cardiovascular system. So when his final crisis came, it shocked the public but not necessarily everyone who had seen the quieter, more exhausted version of Harding behind closed doors. 64. Harding's sudden death on the Western tour. Harding's last days unfolded far from Washington, on a tour meant to showcase a relaxed, accessible president reconnecting with the country. In 1923, he embarked on what was called the Voyage of Understanding, a massive cross-country trip by train and ship that took him to Alaska and the Pacific coast. The schedule was punishing: long travel days, multiple speeches, public receptions, and constant social demands, all layered on top of an existing pattern of fatigue and chest discomfort. By the time his party reached the West Coast, Harding was visibly tired, sometimes leaning on others for support and complaining of stomach pains and weakness. Doctors traveling with him diagnosed ptomaine poisoning from bad seafood, then acute indigestion, reflecting how often abdominal complaints were blamed for what we now recognize as cardiac symptoms. After he arrived in San Francisco and checked into the Palace Hotel, his condition seemed to improve slightly, and he even sat up in bed to review speeches and chat with his wife. Then, on the evening of August 2, 1923, while Florence Harding was reading to him, he reportedly shuddered, convulsed, and collapsed back onto the pillows. Efforts to revive him failed. The president, who had set out to reassure the nation, died in a hotel suite thousands of miles from the capital, turning a goodwill tour into an immediate succession crisis. 65. Confusion over Harding's exact cause of death. In the hours and days after Harding died, the medical story shifted uneasily, reflecting both limited diagnostics and political caution. His primary physician first described the event as a stroke of apoplexy, old terminology for a sudden neurological catastrophe, blaming a blood vessel in the brain. Almost immediately, others suggested acute heart failure, pointing to his history of high blood pressure, chest pain, and recent exertion on the trip. Newspaper accounts vacillated between stroke, paralysis, cerebral hemorrhage, and heart attack, each label carrying different implications about what had actually failed inside his body. Without ECGs, cardiac enzymes, or brain imaging, doctors were left to interpret the scene: a sudden collapse, brief convulsions, and rapid death, all of which could fit either a massive myocardial infarction or a major cerebral event. Eventually, the consensus among most medical historians settled on cardiac causes, likely a fatal heart attack or arrhythmia linked to chronic cardiovascular disease, rather than a primary brain bleed. But that conclusion came after the fact, pieced together from symptoms, earlier complaints, and physicians' notes rather than from definitive tests. For the grieving public, the technical distinctions mattered less than the shock. The president had been alive and speaking only days before, and now the country was being told that his body had simply reached an unseen breaking point. 66. No autopsy. Lasting questions. One reason Harding's death remains medically hazy is simple: no one ever opened his body to look inside. Florence Harding refused an autopsy, a decision that was not unusual for the era, but had major consequences for how clearly doctors could describe the cause of death. Within hours, embalmers began preparing the president's remains for transport and viewing, effectively erasing any chance of later examination. Without a post-mortem, suspicions naturally bloomed around the gaps. everything from whispered poisoning rumors to speculation about undiagnosed conditions, but these theories rest more on imagination than evidence. Harding himself had been aware of his own decline, telling aides on the trip that he felt all in and worrying aloud about his health. The medical records that do exist point consistently toward chronic heart disease and acute cardiac failure as the likeliest explanation for his sudden collapse. Still, in a century when most other presidential deaths have detailed autopsy reports, lab results, and modern diagnostic reinterpretations, Harding's case stands out as oddly unresolved. The hotel room, the hurried embalming, the lack of internal examination, all of it leaves us with a president whose final moments are documented, but whose exact final failing organ will probably never be known with absolute certainty. 67 Calvin Coolidge's coronary thrombosis at home after Harding's ambiguous medical exit. His successor's death would be clinically clearer but no less sudden. Calvin Coolidge, the famously restrained Silent Cal, left the White House in 1929 and retreated to a quieter life in Northampton, Massachusetts. He wasn't widely seen as frail. He took walks, kept a modest routine, and didn't project obvious physical decline. But by the early 1930s he had high blood pressure, intermittent chest discomfort, and the same era's limited understanding of what those symptoms meant. On January 5, 1933, while Grace Coolidge was out shopping, he reportedly went upstairs to his dressing room after breakfast. A servant later found him lying on the floor, unresponsive. Doctors were summoned, but there was nothing to be done. They declared that he had died from coronary thrombosis, essentially a clot in the arteries feeding his heart, causing a fatal heart attack. Unlike Harding, there was little debate about sudden cardiac collapse being the cause. The timing, the circumstances, and the medical vocabulary all lined up neatly with the emerging concept of coronary disease. Silent in life, he exited in a way that fit his public persona. No drawn-out decline, just a quiet, abrupt final stop in the privacy of his own home. 68. Coolidge's quiet morning and handwritten note. The small, almost domestic details of Coolidge's last morning reinforced the image he'd cultivated for years. He woke in the usual way, had his breakfast, and went through mail, including some routine business and personal correspondence. At some point, he sat down and wrote a brief, now famous note about his successor, Herbert Hoover. "I do not choose to run for president" in 1928 had been his earlier public line, but his private assessment of Hoover was more skeptical, tinged with doubt. On his final morning, he reportedly penned or reviewed another short handwritten line, reflecting in his tight, understated script on politics and the times. Then he went upstairs, alone. When he was discovered, that quiet paper trail, a few lines in his own hand, left on a desk became part of the narrative. The former president, who had avoided drama and grand speeches, finished his life as he had lived much of it, with minimal words, minimal fuss, and very little shared about what he truly felt. His death, uneventful in its logistics, deepened the sense that Americans had never fully known the inner life of the man who'd once occupied the nation's loudest office. 69. Herbert Hoover's massive state funeral. If Coolidge's end felt small and private, Herbert Hoover's was the opposite, expansive, ceremonial, and richly choreographed. Hoover left office in 1933 deeply unpopular, blamed by many for the Great Depression's worst miseries. But over the next 3 decades, he slowly rebuilt his public image through humanitarian work, commissioned leadership, and quiet advisory roles to later presidents. By the time he died in 1964 at the age of 90, the country had lived through World War II, the early Cold War, and the Kennedy assassination. Hoover was a relic of an earlier era, but also a symbol of institutional continuity. The government organized a full state funeral with all the traditional honors. His body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Thousands filed past the casket, and the procession moved with military precision. Foreign dignitaries, former presidents, and current officials attended, signaling that however controversial his presidency had been, the office itself demanded a final formal respect. The scale of the ceremony startled some younger Americans, who knew Hoover mostly as a name tied to economic collapse, not as a long-lived former president whose career had stretched from pre-World War I engineering to atomic-age advisory roles. His funeral showed how, over time, public memory can soften, recast, and eventually cloak even contentious leaders in the standard rituals of national mourning. 70. Hoover's unusually long presidential lifespan. Hoover's ability to have such a funeral at all hinged on something simple. He outlived almost everyone. Born in 1874, he lived long enough to see television, jet travel, and nuclear weapons become normal parts of American life. He was in his late 80s and still giving speeches, writing, and corresponding with world leaders, his frame thinner but his mind reported as sharp. Hoover survived serious illnesses, the stress of immense public blame, and the emotional wear of watching multiple global crises unfold after his presidency. When he died in New York in 1964, he was 90 years old, making him at that point one of the longest-lived presidents in history. Only much later would others like Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H. W. Bush, and Jimmy Carter surpass or match that kind of longevity. For a man whose political career had seemed finished in disgrace by 1933, the sheer length of his life gave him time to revise his legacy, mentor successors, and witness a transformation of the presidency itself, from radio addresses and rail trips to televised debates and intercontinental flights. His death marked not just the passing of a former president, but the quiet end of a human bridge between the Gilded Age and the Space Age. 71. Franklin Roosevelt's hidden decline in office. While Hoover's advanced age unfolded mostly outside the spotlight, Franklin Roosevelt experienced his health crisis in the brightest glare imaginable, but much of it stayed deliberately obscured. FDR entered the White House in 1933, already living with permanent paralysis from polio, a condition he and his team managed to keep partially masked from the public eye. As World War II intensified, so did the strain on his body. By 1944, during his campaign for a fourth term, he was dealing with severe hypertension, congestive heart failure, weight loss, fatigue, and episodes of breathlessness, all classic warning signs. His doctors recorded blood pressure readings that would now trigger emergency care, but then were treated with rest, restricted travel, and limited transparency. Photographs and newsreels were carefully controlled to show him seated, smiling, jacket buttoned, often hiding the gauntness and dark circles visible in less public moments. When he traveled to the Yalta Conference in early 1945, foreign leaders and some reporters privately remarked on how frail he looked, how much effort simple movements seemed to require, yet official statements insisted he was merely tired from war work. The possibility that the commander-in-chief was living with life-threatening cardiac disease was not openly discussed with the public, and even many in Washington didn't grasp how precarious his condition had become. 72. Roosevelt's sudden cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs. The break point came not in Washington or at a summit, but in the place FDR associated with physical renewal. In April 1945, he retreated to Warm Springs, Georgia, the spa community where he had long gone for polio therapy in the mineral waters. The plan was simple: rest, work on a speech for the upcoming United Nations Founding Conference, and recover some strength away from the constant demands of wartime leadership. On April 12, he was sitting for a portrait, then later working with aides, when he complained of a terrible pain in the back of his head and collapsed. Physicians on site quickly recognized the signs of a catastrophic brain event, a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a blood vessel in his brain rupturing under the pressure of long-standing hypertension. He never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead that afternoon. The news shocked a public accustomed to seeing him as an almost inexhaustible figure, even if thinner and grayer in recent photos. Medical records released later confirmed that his cardiovascular system had been under immense, poorly controlled stress for years. The president who had guided the nation through depression and nearly through the war's end died in a small Georgia cottage, felled not by an assassin or battlefield accident, but by a blood vessel giving way after decades of relentless work and partially hidden disease. 73. Roosevelt's blood pressure crisis. FDR's fatal brain bleed wasn't a bolt from the blue. His medical charts had been flashing red for years. By 1944, his doctors were recording blood pressure readings that would terrify a modern cardiologist, numbers like 210, over 120 and higher. Hypertension that severe quietly batters the heart, the kidneys, and especially the delicate vessels inside the brain. Yet the treatments available were primitive: rest, sedatives, diet changes, vague advice to slow down in the middle of a world war. No effective blood pressure pills, No aggressive interventions, and no real push to remove him from the stress that was driving it. His personal physician, Admiral Ross McIntyre, downplayed the danger in public and often in private briefings, insisting the president was just tired. Later release of his medical records showed a pattern of crisis-level readings, headaches, weight loss, and shortness of breath, classic signs that his cardiovascular system was closing in on catastrophe. It wasn't just bad luck at Warm Springs. It was the endpoint of chronic, poorly controlled disease that everyone around him tried not to name out loud. 74. Roosevelt's wartime image management part of how that danger stayed hidden was deliberate stagecraft, honed from the earliest days of his presidency. FDR, who already depended on braces and careful choreography to mask his paralysis, extended that same management to his wartime frailty. Photographers were instructed not to capture him being lifted, wheeled, or visibly struggling, and most followed the rule. Public appearances were shorter, timed for his better hours, with chairs placed so he could appear upright and commanding. The hollowness in his cheeks, the tremor in his hands, the sag of his shoulders were edited out by camera angles, distance, and friendly editors. Newsreels emphasized his voice and his smile, not the shuffle of aides hovering close in case he faltered. Even at Yalta, where foreign leaders privately worried he might not survive much longer, the official photos suggested calm authority rather than a man in advanced heart failure. In an age before televised press conferences and 24-hour coverage, a small circle of aides and physicians could still decide what the country saw and what it would only learn years later from declassified files and unfiltered medical notes. 75. Harry Truman's pneumonia, the man who authorized nuclear strikes and stared down the early Cold War, died from something far more ordinary. Harry Truman left office in 1953 and settled into a modest retirement in Independence, Missouri, where he lived a surprisingly unguarded life: daily walks, visits to the library, chats with neighbors. He had falls, minor illnesses, and the gradual slowing of a man in his 80s, but no single dramatic diagnosis that dominated headlines. In December 1972, at age 88, he developed congestion and trouble breathing, symptoms that rapidly worsened into pneumonia. Hospitalized in Kansas City, he slipped into organ failure as the infection overwhelmed his aging body. There was no sudden assassination, no mysterious poisoning, just the quiet, clinical progression of a lung infection in a very old man. He died on December 26, and doctors listed pneumonia, multiple organ failure, and circulatory collapse as the chain that ended the life of a president whose political decisions had once reshaped the globe. 76. Truman's long public farewell. Because Truman lived almost 2 decades after he left office, his death felt less like a political crisis and more like a closing chapter. By 1972, the world he had helped build, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the early architecture of the Cold War, was already history to younger Americans. He had become the white-haired figure at library dedications and oral history interviews, a man more associated with anecdotes about walks into town than with firing MacArthur or recognizing Israel. When the news broke that he was gone, there was mourning, but not the destabilizing shock that had accompanied FDR's sudden death in wartime. His funeral was dignified but comparatively restrained, focused on his Methodist church in Independence and the presidential library he'd helped design. Commentators framed his passing as the fading of a generation, not the loss of an active political force. Truman's death belonged to memory, to scholars and archivists and aging contemporaries, rather than to immediate questions of succession or national survival. 77. Dwight Eisenhower's heart history. If Truman's end was quietly respiratory, Eisenhower's was relentlessly cardiac. Long before his final days, his heart had already dictated major chapters of his life. As president, he suffered a major heart attack in 1955 while in Colorado, an event that forced weeks of hospitalization and sparked public debate about whether he should run again. Doctors later found evidence of long-standing coronary artery disease, narrowed vessels feeding his heart, the product of genetics, stress, diet, and the era's limited preventive medicine. He also endured a stroke in 1957 and surgery for Crohn's disease, complications that further strained his circulation. After leaving office, he had additional heart attacks in 1965 and 1968, each one leaving more scarred muscle and less reserve for the next crisis. By the time he entered his final hospitalization, his cardiologist knew they were managing a chronically failing pump, not a single fixable event. His death in 1969 was officially from congestive heart failure, the culmination of years of damaged cardiac tissue slowly losing the fight to keep his body supplied with blood. 78. Eisenhower died at Walter Reed Eisenhower, spent his last years moving in and out of one of the military's most storied medical centers. Walter Reed. The former Supreme Commander trusted the institution that had treated him during his presidency, returning there repeatedly for cardiac monitoring, procedures, and recovery after each new setback. In late 1968, he was admitted again with chest pain and worsening heart failure, this time to a special presidential suite where teams of cardiologists rotated through around the clock. They tried the available therapies of the era: oxygen, diuretics, careful diet, bed rest, and medications that seemed blunt by today's standards. Over months, his condition seesawed, occasionally improving enough that he could receive visitors and follow news, then slipping back as his weakened heart struggled. On March 28, 1969, after yet another heart attack, his circulation finally collapsed despite intensive care. He died surrounded not by battlefield noise or political crowds, but by the quiet routines of a military hospital hallway, another former commander-in-chief whose last battle was fought in the space between beeping monitors and handwritten charts. 79. Kennedy's autopsy controversies. When John F. Kennedy's body arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital the evening of November 22, the country assumed a flawless, meticulous autopsy would follow. What actually unfolded was hurried, crowded, and shaped as much by military protocol and political urgency as by medical precision. The pathologists, experienced but untested in high-profile gunshot forensics, worked under intense pressure with senior officers and officials watching from just a few feet away. Notes were dictated rather than carefully written as they went. Measurements of wounds were recorded but sometimes inconsistently, and key photographs were later reported missing or mislabeled. The brain, central to understanding bullet paths, was removed for further study, but its later whereabouts became murky, fueling decades of confusion and speculation. Some tissue samples and X-rays were preserved, others vanished into classified archives or chain of custody gaps that were never fully explained. The Warren Commission relied on an autopsy report that had been drafted after the fact, from imperfect notes and memory, rather than a complete contemporaneous record. Subsequent panels in the 1970s and 1990s criticized the documentation and said a modern forensic autopsy would have been done very differently. None of that proves any particular conspiracy theory. It simply means the one examination that mattered most in understanding a presidential assassination was less rigorous and less transparent than the public was led to believe. 80. Kennedy's head and neck wounds. Behind all the arguments about angles and trajectories sits a brutal medical reality. Kennedy's fatal injuries were catastrophic. In Dallas, Parkland Hospital doctors first saw a president lying motionless on a stretcher, with a deep wound in his throat and a massive, gaping injury to the right side of his head. They performed an emergency tracheotomy through the neck wound, obscuring some of its original appearance in the process, because their only concern in that moment was trying to establish an airway. The head wound exposed shattered skull, torn scalp, and brain tissue already protruding, signs that the underlying damage was beyond the reach of 1960s medicine. At Bethesda, the autopsy physicians documented a small wound in the upper back, and extensive destruction of the right parietal and occipital regions of the skull. They concluded that at least one bullet entered from behind, and that the massive head wound represented the exit of a high-velocity shot. Later reviews disagreed about the exact locations and shapes of those wounds, in part because Parkland staff remembered what they saw before emergency procedures, while Bethesda doctors worked on a body that had already been altered. Still, all official medical panels, despite their differences on details, agreed on one point: the lethal head injury was so severe that death, whether instantaneous or within moments, was medically unavoidable. 81. Kennedy's casket changes. Most Americans picture a single solemn casket carrying Kennedy from Dallas to Washington and then to his grave, but there were actually two. The first was a heavy bronze-colored casket hastily purchased at an Oak Cliff funeral home, and used to remove his body from Parkland Hospital under chaotic emotional circumstances. That casket flew with him on Air Force One, was carried into Bethesda, and absorbed blood and fluids during the autopsy, leaving it stained and structurally stressed. When the time came to present the president to the public, officials quietly decided it wasn't suitable for the Capitol Rotunda or the televised funeral. A second, more formal mahogany casket was chosen for the lying in state and burial, matching the image of dignified, controlled mourning the White House wanted the world to see. The original Dallas casket, now effectively an uncomfortable relic, was stored away at the National Archives as a gruesome artifact of the assassination night. In the 1960s, after debates about what should be done with it, the government ultimately had it sealed in a metal container and dropped into the Atlantic Ocean, deep water intended to keep it from ever becoming a morbid collectible. The public ceremony kept its smooth, unbroken line, while the messier logistical story of two caskets and a midnight disposal sank quietly out of view. 82. Kennedy's eternal flame at Arlington National Cemetery. The most enduring image of Kennedy's death is not the autopsy room or the motorcade, but a small, steady flame. Jacqueline Kennedy wanted something that felt ancient and symbolic, a memorial that would speak in the language of centuries rather than election cycles. She had seen eternal flames in Europe at war memorials and tombs of unknown soldiers, and asked that a similar flame mark her husband's grave. Engineers in the military worked quickly, designing a gas-fed burner that could stay alight in wind and rain, surrounded initially by a simple white picket fence and fresh earth. During the funeral, she used a taper to light it herself, a quiet gesture that became one of the most replayed moments of the ceremony. Over time, the gravesite was redesigned into a more formal plaza with stone, landscaping, and a more sophisticated ignition system that automatically relights the flame if it is ever extinguished. It has gone out occasionally during maintenance in heavy rain or from a stray splash of holy water, but is quickly restored, its continuity carefully guarded. The eternal flame turned one violent, specific death into a broader symbol of public service and memory, a place where mourners still gather not to debate ballistics, but to watch a small fire burn against the backdrop of Washington's skyline. 83. Lyndon Johnson's second heart attack. While Kennedy's death came from a rifle in Dallas, his successor's life ended years later in rural Texas, undone by his own heart. Lyndon Johnson had long-standing cardiovascular disease, a fact that shadowed his presidency and colored his personal habits. He'd suffered a major heart attack in 1955 as Majority Leader, an event so serious it briefly threatened his political future and left visible scars on his medical record. By the time he left the White House in 1969, he was heavier, more sedentary, and still smoking despite doctors' warnings, a man who had spent years under crushing stress. At his ranch in Johnson City, he alternated between bursts of activity and long, restless periods of watching war coverage and news about the country he'd tried to reshape. On January 22, 1973, alone in his bedroom except for a phone line to the Secret Service, he experienced chest pain and shortness of breath that rapidly escalated. He managed to call for help, but collapsed before he could be evacuated, his damaged heart finally overwhelmed. An emergency flight to San Antonio and attempts at resuscitation could not reverse the extensive myocardial damage that had been building for decades. Officially, he died of a massive heart attack, acute myocardial infarction at age 64, another president whose life ended not by assassination, but by the slow arithmetic of blocked arteries and accumulated strain. 84. Johnson's fear of dying. Young Johnson's cardiologist could chart his blood pressure and cholesterol, but the former president carried another metric in his head: his family's history. Men in the Johnson line tended to die young, often in their 60s or earlier, usually from heart disease or strokes that arrived abruptly. As a young man, he watched relatives collapse unexpectedly, funerals stacking up at ages that felt uncomfortably close to his own. Even while he was in office, he talked openly with aides and biographers about the sense that he was living on borrowed time, pushing his body harder than it was meant to go. The 1955 heart attack only sharpened that awareness. From then on, he read every new chest flutter or bout of fatigue as a possible signal of the end. Sometimes he tried to outmaneuver fate with brief health kicks, periods of swimming, attempts to lose weight, half-hearted efforts to cut back on cigarettes. More often, he reverted to the foods, drinks, and late-night habits that comforted him in the face of that looming deadline. Friends later recalled that in retirement he seemed haunted by the idea that he would not see old age, almost resigned to a shorter lifespan. When his second major heart attack finally came, it felt to many around him less like a surprise and more like the fulfillment of a prophecy he had been quietly reciting for most of his adult life. 85. Richard Nixon's final stroke. By the time Richard Nixon suffered his last stroke in April 1994, his body had already been shaped by decades of political combat, heavy travel, and a lifelong struggle with stress he rarely admitted in public. He collapsed alone at home in New Jersey, a familiar scene for presidents who outlive the constant monitoring of the White House, but not the damage their years in office did to their cardiovascular systems. The stroke, an acute cerebrovascular accident, left him with massive brain bleeding and profound neurological impairment, essentially cutting off the connections that made speech, movement, and consciousness possible. Doctors at New York Hospital Cornell stabilized him enough for intensive care, but quickly realized the injury was irreversible, the swelling and bleeding too extensive to meaningfully reverse. He never regained full consciousness, spending his last days in a medically managed twilight surrounded by family, while the country learned of his condition through careful, controlled statements. 4 days after the stroke, his heart finally stopped, the official cause of death listed as a severe cerebral vascular accident, a clinical phrase for the quiet internal catastrophe that had already ended the man long before the machines were turned off. 86. Nixon's complicated funeral redemption. Nixon's state-style funeral, broadcast across the country, looked on the surface like the familiar script of national reconciliation, but it also marked an unusual arc of public rehabilitation for a president who had resigned in disgrace. Former rivals, including those who had run against him or investigated him, came to Yorba Linda to offer eulogies that leaned heavily on his foreign policy achievements and Cold War diplomacy. They spoke about opening China, détente with the Soviet Union, and arms control, carefully framing Watergate as a tragic flaw in an otherwise consequential career rather than the defining story. The presence of every living former president and a sitting president at his service signaled that, in the club of those who had held the office, he was still considered one of them, not an exile forever frozen in August 1974. Viewers saw a casket draped in the flag, a Marine band, and formal honors that mirrored those given to presidents who left office more peacefully, reminding people that the institution often chooses to remember its members in broad strokes. The funeral did not erase the crimes and abuses of power, but it did show how, at the end, the narrative around a president's death can soften into something more ambiguous than the scandal headlines that once seemed permanent. 87. Gerald Ford's quiet longevity record. Gerald Ford, the man who became president without ever being elected on a national ticket, quietly set another unusual record when he died in 2006. At 93 years and 165 days, he surpassed Ronald Reagan's previous mark to become the longest-lived president in American history, up to that point. Unlike the dramatic deaths of men like Lincoln or Kennedy, Ford's passing at his home in Rancho Mirage, California, came after years of gradually declining health, including heart issues and pneumonia. His long lifespan reflected a different era of presidential aftercare, where post-White House figures received better cardiology, regular screenings, and medical monitoring than their 19th century counterparts could have imagined. It also showed how some presidents, especially those who left office under less crushing circumstances, managed to stretch into decades of relatively private life, making public appearances but largely avoiding the intense stress that had defined their earlier years. When he finally died, the headlines noted his longevity as much as his brief presidency, framing his life as a slow, extended exit from power rather than a sudden vanishing point. 88. Ford's arteriosclerotic decline. Ford's death certificate told a story written not in headlines, but in arteries slowly hardening over time. The official cause listed arteriosclerotic cerebrovascular disease and diffuse arteriosclerosis, medical language for widespread buildup of plaque in his blood vessels that narrowed pathways and reduced blood flow to the brain and other organs. Over years, that process increases the risk of strokes, mini-strokes, heart problems, and the kind of general frailty that makes even minor illnesses harder to survive. Ford had undergone heart procedures and hospitalizations in his later years, each episode a reminder that his circulatory system was gradually losing its flexibility and resilience. By the end of 2006, Those accumulated changes, rather than a single dramatic event, finally overwhelmed his body, leading to his death at home at 93. His case illustrated how, for many modern presidents, the end comes not from one catastrophic moment, but from long-running vascular disease that medicine can slow and manage, but not ultimately stop. 89. Jimmy Carter's long hospice decision. When Jimmy Carter chose to enter hospice care at home in 2023, and then kept living month after month, he quietly rewrote expectations about how former presidents talk about the end of life. Instead of sudden bulletins from a hospital or vague references to illness, his family and foundation openly said he was declining further medical interventions and focusing on comfort. That transparency forced the public to think about presidential aging not as a private shame or sudden crisis, but as a normal, shared human process. His long stay in hospice, far exceeding what many people imagine when they hear the word, highlighted how end-of-life care can stretch out, with periods of stability punctuated by setbacks. It also drew attention to the question of how much health information very old leaders should share, and when something that had usually been handled with secrecy for sitting presidents and former ones alike. Carter's steady, quiet approach turned his final chapter into a kind of civics lesson about mortality, dignity, and the limits of medicine, rather than a single day of breaking news. 90. Ronald Reagan's decade of Alzheimer's. Ronald Reagan's death in 2004 came after a 10-year public journey with Alzheimer's disease that changed how Americans thought about presidential memory and decline. When he announced his diagnosis in a handwritten letter in 1994, he effectively invited the nation to watch, from a respectful distance, as his world gradually narrowed. The disease slowly stripped away short-term memory, reasoning, and eventually recognition, leaving his wife Nancy and a small circle of caregivers to manage his daily life behind the gates of their Los Angeles home. As his condition worsened, questions about whether early symptoms might have appeared near the end of his presidency surfaced in media and academic discussions, though his physicians said they saw no clear evidence during his time in office. Over the years, his long private fade helped bring Alzheimer's out of the shadows, turning a former commander-in-chief into the most famous patient of a disease many families were quietly facing. When he finally died of pneumonia, a common complication in advanced dementia, his passing felt less like a sudden shock and more like the closing of a chapter the country had been preparing for since his letter first used the phrase, "the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life." 91. Reagan's vanishing from the public stage. By the time Reagan's Alzheimer's advanced into its later stages, the man who had once mastered the camera had quietly vanished from it. After his 1994 letter, public sightings grew rare, then almost non-existent, as Nancy Reagan and doctors tightened the circle around him, shielding him from flashes and questions he could no longer process. The same public that had watched him joke through debates and crises now had to accept carefully worded updates instead of appearances, vague references to good days and bad days standing in for any real description of decline. In his final years, his world shrank to a few rooms, familiar faces and routines designed to reduce confusion, a stark contrast to motorcades, briefing rooms and roaring crowds. His absence from public life showed how, for modern presidents with long degenerative illnesses, the last chapter often happens entirely offstage, managed by families who balance privacy, dignity, and the expectations that still cling to a former head of state. 92. George H.W. Bush's quiet longevity record. George H. W. Bush's death in 2018 at 94 quietly moved the longest-lived president marker forward again, building on Ford's and Reagan's records. His later years were marked by Parkinson's-like symptoms, including wheelchair use and falls, but he continued to make selective public appearances, from throwing the first pitch to attending state events. Medical teams monitored his heart rhythm, infections, and breathing, extending his life well beyond what 19th-century presidents with similar issues could have expected. When he finally died at home in Houston from complications of vascular Parkinsonism and other age-related conditions, his age became part of the story, evidence of how advances in cardiology, antibiotics, and long-term care have stretched presidential lives into their 90s, turning old age itself into a common final diagnosis. 93. George H.W. Bush's final year of loss. Bush's last year was marked by the kind of quiet, personal grief that rarely appears in official timelines. Barbara Bush, his wife of 73 years, died in April 2018, leaving a void that family members later said he felt deeply, even as he tried to project steadiness at her funeral. He was hospitalized shortly afterward for a blood infection, a reminder of how stress and sorrow can strain already fragile systems in very old bodies. In the months that followed, he attended family events when he could, but his energy and resilience visibly faded, and friends noticed how often he spoke about Barbara. When he died that November, many observers noted the patterns seen in other long marriages, presidential and otherwise. One partner's death followed fairly quickly by the others, a reminder that the emotional bonds of a lifetime can quietly shape the timing of a president's physical decline. 94. The growing spectacle of state funerals, presidential funerals, which began as relatively simple church services with limited ceremony, gradually evolved into complex, carefully choreographed national rituals. Lincoln's multi-city funeral train set an early template, but later ceremonies added more layers, lying in state under the Capitol dome, precision military escorts, scripted eulogies from successors and rivals, global delegations. Television turned those rituals into shared national events, so planners started timing processions, music, and speeches for maximum clarity and solemnity on screen. Over time, every element, caisson routes, flyovers, gun salutes, folded flags, was standardized in Pentagon manuals, making modern state funerals less improvised memorials and more institutional performances of continuity, designed as much for the living watching at home as for the leader in the casket. 95. When presidents died at home before modern intensive care units and air ambulances, presidents and ex-presidents often faced their final illnesses not under fluorescent hospital lights, but at home. George Washington died at Mount Vernon, Abraham Lincoln in a private boarding house bedroom, James Garfield in a seaside cottage turned sick room, Zachary Taylor in the White House itself, treated with whatever their household doctors and attendants could manage. Those deaths unfolded in parlors and bedrooms crowded with family, physicians, and sometimes cabinet members, with treatments limited to bleeding, purging, opiates, and whatever new tonics were fashionable. The line between public office and private space blurred as messengers carried updates from the sick room to newspapers and crowds outside. But the actual moment of death remained a domestic scene, not yet relocated to the controlled, monitored environment that defines most modern presidential endings. 96. When autopsies were skipped or limited autopsies, which now feel routine after major deaths of public figures, were once inconsistent, especially for presidents. William Henry Harrison received a partial examination. Zachary Taylor was buried without a full autopsy, leading to later exhumation and contested poisoning theories. James K. Polk's death from cholera complications was documented clinically, but not explored in modern forensic detail. Even in the 20th century, some presidential autopsies focused narrowly on immediate causes, like heart damage or stroke, without probing every possible underlying condition. That patchwork record leaves gaps for historians and medical researchers who must piece together symptoms, doctors' notes, and family accounts instead of definitive pathology reports, ensuring that some questions about what exactly killed certain presidents will probably never be answered with complete certainty. 97. Infection was a repeating presidential killer. Before antibiotics, an injury or fever that seems minor today could turn lethal for a president within days. George Washington's throat infection likely worsened as doctors bled and purged him, weakening his ability to fight it. James A. Garfield didn't die from the bullet alone. He died from weeks of doctors probing the wound with unwashed hands and instruments, inviting infection deeper into his body. William McKinley initially seemed stable after surgery, but peritonitis set in when his stomach wound leaked, and there were no effective drugs to stop it. Again and again, sepsis quietly finished what accidents, bullets, or routine illnesses began. 98. Secrecy often shaped public understanding. Presidential medicine has often been as much about managing information as treating disease. Grover Cleveland's secret cancer surgery happened on a yacht, with his jaw tumor removed while newspapers were told he was on vacation. Woodrow Wilson's massive stroke in 1919 was softened into talk of nervous exhaustion, while his wife and doctor filtered what anyone saw or heard about his true condition. Franklin Roosevelt's heart failure risk was minimized in public statements, even as his blood pressure soared into dangerous ranges. By the time John F. Kennedy's multiple chronic illnesses became widely known, He'd already been presented for years as simply tanned and vigorous. 99. Burial places form a national map. If you trace presidential graves on a map, you'd get a scattered atlas of American history rather than a single sacred hill. Washington lies at Mount Vernon in Virginia, Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, Grant in a massive New York City tomb, Kennedy at Arlington with an eternal flame. Others rest at small hometown cemeteries, family plots or library complexes. Truman in Independence, Missouri, Eisenhower in Abilene, Kansas, both Bush presidents in College Station, Texas. There is no official presidential mausoleum or national crypt, just this quiet network of sites that turn local grounds into unexpected stops on a national pilgrimage. 100 Power never bought more time for all the motorcades, doctors, and secured compounds. The presidency has never been a shield against mortality. 4 were shot despite layers of guards. 4 more died in office from strokes, heart failure, or sudden gastrointestinal collapse, and many others slipped away from cancers, infections, and dementias that ignored titles and legacies. Some died days after leaving office, like James K. Polk. Some lived far into old age, like John Adams and George H. W. Bush, but still followed the same human arc. The pattern across 2 centuries is quietly blunt. Ultimate political power never included an exemption from a finite final chapter. You've just heard 100 fragments of endings, stitched together into a quiet alternate history of the presidency. Assassinations that hinged on a single turn, infections that modern antibiotics would erase, strokes hidden behind carefully worded bulletins, and 4th of July coincidences that felt like messages but were really just timing. Secret surgeries on yachts, botched operations in dim operating rooms, funerals that turned small towns into brief centers of gravity. Strip away the marble and the myths, and every one of them faced the same narrowing hallway at the end. That's the thread running underneath all of it. The motorcades stop, the briefings end, and the body keeps its own schedule. Even here at the top of the pyramid, no one has ever been able to buy a single extra hour.